On the night of April 14, 1986, 18 American F-111 strike aircraft lifted off from the Royal Air Force Base at Lakenheath in Suffolk, England, and turned their noses south toward the Mediterranean. They flew through the night at low altitude, threading around French and Spanish airspace that had been denied to them, accompanied by reconnaissance planes, electronic warfare aircraft, and a fleet of tankers that would refuel them during the nearly 11 hours of round-trip flight required to reach their targets and return. The mission was called Operation El Dorado Canyon. It had been authorized by President Ronald Reagan in direct response to the bombing of the La Belle discotheque in West Berlin 9 days earlier, an attack that had killed 2 American servicemen and a Turkish woman, and wounded more than 200 others. Reagan had promised a swift and unmistakable response, and the American military was prepared to deliver one. What made that mission possible was not simply the courage of the aircrews or the sophistication of American hardware. It was intelligence. In the days following the Berlin bombing, American signals analysts had intercepted and read a series of diplomatic cables flowing between Tripoli and the Libyan People's Bureau in East Berlin. The messages were explicit. Libyan officials had congratulated the operatives involved, discussed the execution of the attack, and referenced plans for future operations against American targets. There was no ambiguity, no inference to be drawn. The intelligence was direct, detailed, and specific enough to carry into a presidential briefing and place before the Congress of the United States as justification for a military strike against a sovereign nation. The machines that Libyan officials had used to encrypt those cables bore the name and reputation of a Swiss company headquartered in the calm, prosperous canton of Zug, a small city of church steeples and lakeside promenades on the northern edge of the Swiss Alps. The company was called Crypto AG. It manufactured cipher machines that governments around the world relied upon to protect their most sensitive communications. Its equipment had been sold to more than 120 countries, from the oil ministries of the Persian Gulf to the presidential palaces of South America, from the foreign affairs departments of sub-Saharan Africa to the military commands of Southeast Asia. Its reputation rested on 2 pillars: Swiss precision engineering and Swiss political neutrality, and the combination had made Crypto AG the dominant force in the global encryption market for decades. Every assurance of security that the company had ever offered to those governments was a fabrication. For more than 50 years, Crypto AG had been secretly owned and controlled by 2 of the world's most consequential intelligence organizations, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States and the West German Federal Intelligence Service, known formally as the Bundesnachrichtendienst or BND. The cipher machines the company sold were not the impenetrable shields its marketing materials described. They were instruments of surveillance, carefully engineered with hidden weaknesses that allowed American and West German analysts to strip away the encryption and read the underlying messages as though they had been sent in plain text. Foreign ministers had composed dispatches on machines they believed were inviolable. Military commanders had transmitted operational orders. Heads of state had sent instructions to their ambassadors and their agents. All of it, every cable, every communique, every classified exchange, had flowed into the hands of the agencies that secretly held the keys. The CIA, reflecting on this achievement in its own classified internal history, chose a phrase of almost theatrical modesty: the intelligence coup of the century. A Swiss encryption company, 120 countries, 50 years of deception. Every cable, every military order, every diplomatic secret sent by foreign ministers and heads of state on machines they believed were inviolable, flowing directly into the hands of the CIA and West German intelligence. The most successful commercial cover operation in the history of modern espionage, and it worked because the customers trusted the brand of Swiss neutrality completely. If that scale of deception has your full attention, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications. The full story of how this was built, maintained, and eventually exposed is one you will not want to miss a single minute of. That document, a classified CIA history exceeding 150 pages in length, remained unknown to the public until February 11, 2020, when the Washington Post, in coordination with the German public broadcaster ZDF and the Swiss public broadcaster SRF, simultaneously published an investigation that stunned foreign governments, electrified the intelligence world, and forced a reckoning with half a century of deception on a global scale. The reporters had obtained both the CIA's internal history of the operation and a parallel account produced by the BND, two documents written in the quiet, self-satisfied language of institutional record-keeping that together constituted one of the most remarkable confessions in the history of modern espionage. The CIA had bought the world's leading encryption company, rigged its products, sold them to governments it wished to spy upon, and then written up the whole enterprise in careful bureaucratic prose for posterity. The reaction was immediate. Diplomatic offices across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America were bombarded with questions their spokesman could not answer. In Bern, the Swiss government convened emergency sessions and launched multiple formal investigations into what had happened under the shield of Swiss neutrality. In Berlin, German parliamentarians demanded to know what the Bundestag had been told and when. In Washington, the Central Intelligence Agency declined to comment. And in the dozens of countries that had spent generations trusting the red and white branding of a Swiss precision instrument company with their most closely guarded secrets, the silence that greeted those revelations was its own kind of answer. The story of Operation Rubicon, the name that came to define the entire enterprise, drawn from the ancient Roman act of crossing a point from which there is no return, is not the story of a single espionage operation or a single act of betrayal. It is the story of a relationship that grew, over decades, from a quiet gentleman's agreement into a full-scale industrial covert program. A commercial company serving as permanent cover for the collection of foreign intelligence on a scale that no covert human network, no matter how extensive, could have matched. It is a story about the intersection of engineering and statecraft, about the precise moment when a private invention became a public deception, and about the extraordinary discipline required to maintain that deception across 5 decades, 3 generations of intelligence officers, and the complete transformation of the global communications landscape. But to understand how any of it was possible, how a Swiss company selling encryption machines became the most valuable signals intelligence asset in the history of American espionage, the story must begin long before the CIA ever involved itself in it. It must begin with the man whose name the company carried into the world, and whose life's work was eventually acquired, transformed, and turned against the very clients it was supposed to protect. Boris Caesar Wilhelm Hagelin was born on September 2, 1892, in the settlement of Adzakent in the Baku region of what was then the Russian Empire, a place of oil derricks, rutted roads, and the smell of petroleum that hung in the flat Caspian air like a permanent weather condition. His father, Carl Wilhelm Hagelin, was a Swedish engineer who had traveled east to work in the Russian petroleum industry during its booming late Victorian expansion. His mother was Swedish as well. Boris Hagelin therefore grew up as a cultural foreigner in the country of his birth, absorbing the Russian landscape and a working knowledge of the Russian language while remaining distinctly, firmly Swedish in education, sensibility, and self-understanding. It was the first of several displacements that would define his character. A life spent operating at the margins of different worlds, at home in none of them completely, and drawing from that position a particular kind of observational clarity about how systems worked and where their weaknesses lay. The Baku oil fields that surrounded his earliest years were themselves a kind of technical education. The rigs and refineries and pipelines that extracted wealth from the ground were complex mechanical systems, and the engineers who kept them running were men who understood that reliability came from precision, and that precision came from understanding every component of a given machine. The young Boris Hagelin absorbed this environment with the attention of a boy who was naturally drawn to the way things worked at a fundamental level, to the logic embedded in mechanisms, to the satisfying predictability of a machine that performed exactly the function it was designed to perform. When the time came for serious education, he was sent to Sweden, as the children of Swedish expatriates typically were, and he eventually enrolled at the Kungliga Tekniska Högskolan in Stockholm, the Royal Institute of Technology, where he studied mechanical engineering with the methodical seriousness that characterized his entire intellectual approach. He was, by the accounts that survive from that period, an excellent student. Precise in his thinking, patient with complexity, and gifted with the particular quality of mind that can hold an abstract mechanical concept and a concrete practical application in view at the same time. He graduated with a degree that certified his technical competence, though no academic credential could have predicted the specific direction his career was about to take. The world into which Boris Hagelin graduated his engineering program was one in which cipher machines, mechanical devices capable of automatically encrypting and decrypting written messages, were still a novelty at the outer edge of commercial possibility. The art of concealing written communication had been practiced since ancient times, but the industrialization of that art, the transformation of cryptography into a reproducible, scalable mechanical process, was barely a generation old. A handful of inventors in Sweden, Germany, and the United States were beginning to explore the possibility that a machine with rotating wheels or moving parts could do automatically what diplomatic clerks had previously done by hand: encode messages with a complexity that no human mind could easily untangle without knowing the specific configuration of the device. It was into this emerging field that Boris Hagelin was about to step. And the steps he would take over the following decades, the machines he would build, the relationships he would form, and the agreement he would eventually sign, would set in motion a chain of events whose consequences, measured in betrayed governments and stolen secrets and intelligence coups of the century, would not become fully visible for nearly 100 years after his birth in the oil fields of the Russian Empire. The Stockholm of the early 1920s was a city balanced between two worlds. One foot still planted in the genteel certainties of the 19th century, the other stepping cautiously into an age of machines, electricity, and the kind of industrial complexity that made old certainties seem quaint. Automobile traffic was beginning to share cobblestone streets with horse-drawn carts. Telephone lines crisscrossed the skyline above neighborhoods that smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread. The Great War had ended a few years before, and Europe was rebuilding itself with a mixture of nervous optimism and the unspoken dread of people who had just witnessed what industrialized warfare could do to a generation of young men. In this particular city, at this particular moment, a young Swedish-Russian engineer named Boris Hagelin was working in the offices of a small company that most of the city's inhabitants had never heard of and could not have explained the purpose of. The company was called Aktiebolaget Cryptograph. It had been founded by an inventor named Arvid Gerhard Damm, a brilliant and somewhat mercurial man who had spent years developing cipher machines, mechanical devices capable of encoding written messages into indecipherable strings of letters, and who had recently secured a Swedish patent for a design he believed represented the future of secure communication. Damm's machines were not the first of their kind. The idea of a mechanical cipher device was already being explored by inventors in Germany and elsewhere, and the competition to produce the most reliable and commercially viable version was just beginning to emerge from the realm of theoretical engineering into something approaching a real market, driven largely by the demands of military and diplomatic communication in the post-war order. But Damm's designs had a particular elegance to them, a clockmaker's precision that attracted attention from people who understood what they were looking at. Boris Hagelin came to Aktiebolaget Cryptograph through a connection that was as much about family networks as professional credentials. His father, Carl Wilhelm Hagelin, had business relationships with Emanuel Nobel, a member of the famous Nobel family whose fortune had been built on Swedish engineering and whose interests extended across multiple industries including, at this particular moment, the young company that Arvid Damm had founded. It was through this connection that Boris Hagelin, fresh from his engineering studies and looking for a position that would make genuine use of his technical training, found himself employed by a firm working on cipher machines at the precise moment when cipher machines were becoming something that governments and military establishments around the world were beginning to take very seriously. He started as what might be described today as a technical marketing representative, a role that required him to understand the machines well enough to explain and demonstrate them to potential customers, most of whom were military or government officials with specific communication security requirements. It was work that suited him. He had the engineer's patient command of technical detail combined with a quality that not all engineers possess: the ability to speak about complex systems to people without engineering backgrounds in terms they could understand and find compelling. He was presentable, articulate, and possessed of a natural authority when discussing technical subjects that made potential clients feel they were in the presence of a genuine expert rather than a salesman with a brochure. Arvid Damm died in 1927, and the circumstances of the company's transition that followed would prove consequential in ways that nobody involved could have anticipated. Damm left the company and its intellectual property in a state of financial uncertainty. The patents were valuable, the technical foundation was solid, but the commercial organization was fragile. Boris Hagelin, by this point sufficiently embedded in the company's operations to understand its assets and its problems, took the initiative to restructure what remained of Dam's enterprise and position it for growth. He did not simply inherit the company. He rebuilt it from the inside out, reorienting its technical development and its commercial strategy around his own vision of what a cipher machine company could become. What he understood, with a clarity that reflected both his engineering instincts and his practical experience selling to military clients, was that the future of cipher machines lay not in complexity for its own sake but in reliability and portability. Military communication in the field required devices that could be operated by personnel with limited technical training, that would function in difficult environmental conditions, that were compact enough to be carried and used in circumstances far from any workshop or repair facility. The great cipher machines of the era tended toward size and elaborateness, impressive engineering spectacles that were best suited for fixed installations like embassy cipher rooms or naval communication centers. What the market was beginning to need, and what no manufacturer had yet fully delivered, was something a soldier or a courier could carry in a bag. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Hagelin worked through a series of prototype designs, refining and iterating with the methodical patience that characterized his entire engineering practice. He produced the B-21, a machine that attracted genuine interest from the French military and resulted in Hagelin's first significant export order, a validation of his commercial instincts as much as his technical ones. The B-21 was followed by the C-36, which improved upon its predecessor in several important respects and extended the company's reach further into European military and diplomatic markets. Each iteration taught Hagelin something about what customers actually needed, what the machine's practical weaknesses were under field conditions, and how the underlying mechanical principles could be refined to produce more reliable and more secure results. He was also, during this period, developing the specific mechanical insight that would eventually define his most important contribution to the art of cipher design, the pin and lug mechanism. The system he developed used a series of rotating wheels or rotors, each equipped with a set of movable pins that could be set in active or inactive positions. As the machine stepped through its cycles during the encryption of a message, the positions and interactions of these pins generated a series of numerical displacements that determined how each letter of the input was shifted to produce the output ciphertext. The genius of the pin and lug system was that it produced a key sequence of extraordinary length, so long that, in principle, it would take a codebreaker longer than a human lifetime to work through all the possible combinations and find the pattern. In practice, this meant that messages encrypted by a properly configured Hagelin machine could resist the kind of frequency analysis and pattern recognition that had broken most earlier ciphers, including those used by all major powers during the First World War. This was not a trivial achievement. The problem of producing ciphertext that resisted statistical attack was the central technical challenge of cryptographic engineering in the early 20th century. Most cipher systems of the era, when examined with sufficient mathematical rigor and a large enough sample of encrypted messages, revealed regularities that allowed a trained analyst to reconstruct the underlying plain text. The longer a particular key was used, the more messages an analyst could collect, the more vulnerable the cipher became. Hagelin's pin and lug mechanism addressed this problem by extending the effective key length far beyond what manual cipher systems had ever achieved, making statistical attacks computationally impractical with the tools available at the time. He was, in the late 1930s, a man of substantial professional accomplishment and growing commercial reputation, running a modestly successful company in a niche of the market that was beginning to attract much more serious attention as the political situation in Europe deteriorated. The rise of Hitler's Germany, the remilitarization of the European powers, the evident approach of a conflict that would dwarf the previous one. All of these developments were intensifying the demand for secure military communication, and the companies and individuals who could supply reliable cipher technology were finding that doors were opening for them that had previously been closed. For Boris Hagelin, the coming war would bring both opportunity and danger. His machines would find their most significant market yet. His relationships with foreign military establishments would reach across the Atlantic. And in the process, he would form the connection that was to alter not only his own life, but the fate of every government that would ever buy a crypto AG machine in the following half-century. His path to that fateful connection ran through Paris, through the refugee tide of a continent coming apart, and eventually through a transatlantic voyage that required him to carry his cipher machines across an ocean while German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes. It was a journey that would end with a handshake in Washington that changed everything, though it would take many more years for the true nature of that change to become apparent. In the last years before the storm broke, Boris Hagelin was still a private businessman with a clever product and a growing client list, unaware of the role that history had already selected for him. The machines he was refining in his Stockholm workshop in the winter of 1939 and 1940 were, by any reasonable standard, the most capable portable cipher devices in the world. The question of who would ultimately control them, and what purpose, beyond the one Boris Hagelin intended, they would ultimately serve, was about to be answered in ways that even the most paranoid of intelligence officers could not have scripted in advance. In the spring of 1940, Boris Hagelin watched Europe collapse from a window in Stockholm and understood that he had very little time. Germany had occupied Denmark and Norway. France was days away from military catastrophe. The neutral countries that remained were drawing up their lists of what might be lost, and Boris Hagelin's calculus was sharply personal. His machines, his patents, and the future of his company were all located in a continent that was rapidly reorganizing itself under the control of a government that had a very clear philosophy about who should own the means of producing anything valuable. He had, in the preceding months, been conducting correspondence with representatives of the United States Army about a cipher machine design he had been developing, a compact, field-portable device based on his pin-and-lug mechanism that the American military had expressed genuine interest in evaluating. The C-38, as Hagelin's latest design was designated, was everything the American Field Army said it needed. Small enough to be carried in a soldier's pack, rugged enough to function in field conditions, and cryptographically sophisticated enough to protect the kind of tactical communications that a modern army generated in enormous quantities. The Americans had seen demonstrations of earlier Hagelin models and had come away impressed. The conversations had been encouraging. And now, with the continent burning and the Atlantic looking like the only safe direction, Hagelin made a decision that was as much practical calculation as personal conviction. He packed 2 working models of the C-38 into a suitcase alongside the technical documentation that would be needed for an American manufacturer to produce the machine at scale. Then he arranged passage to the United States by the only route still available from Stockholm, a carefully managed journey that took him through countries that were not yet fully committed to either side of the war, navigating the increasingly compressed geography of a neutral Europe that was shrinking with each passing week. He arrived in New York in the late spring of 1940, carrying his suitcase of cipher machines across the Atlantic Ocean like a man who understood that what he held represented something considerably more valuable than its physical dimensions suggested. The meeting that followed in Washington would prove to be one of the most consequential introductions in the history of 20th century intelligence, though neither of the men involved could fully understand its significance at the time. The American official that Hagelin had been referred to, the man considered the preeminent authority on cipher machines and cryptanalysis in the United States military, was William Frederick Friedman, the chief cryptanalyst of the Signal Intelligence Service of the United States Army. Friedman was, by any measure, an extraordinary figure, a mathematician, a linguist, a cryptologist who had spent decades systematically dismantling the cipher systems of foreign governments and who had almost single-handedly transformed American cryptanalysis from an amateur gentleman's pursuit into a professional discipline with institutional standing. His work breaking the Japanese diplomatic cipher known as Purple would eventually be regarded as among the signal intellectual achievements of the entire war. But in the spring of 1940, Friedman was still in the uncomfortable position of trying to convince an American military establishment that was not yet at war to take signals intelligence seriously, while simultaneously advising on the cipher security of American communications themselves. He met Boris Hagelin in what would become one of history's most quietly consequential rooms. The 2 men, one a meticulous Swedish-Russian engineer with a suitcase full of prototypes, the other an American cryptanalyst who had spent his career learning how to break machines exactly like the ones being demonstrated, examined the C-38 together with the mutual recognition of 2 people who understood, without any need for explanation, the significance of what they were looking at. Friedman was specifically evaluating whether the C-38 cipher strength was adequate for American military use, whether the sequences it generated were random enough to resist the statistical attacks that he himself had developed. He probed the machine's design, worked through its mathematical underpinnings, tested its key settings and operational parameters with the focused attention of someone whose professional judgment was being staked on the evaluation. His conclusion was positive, but it came with something attached, something that is, in retrospect, the first small thread of the thread that would eventually unravel into Operation Rubicon. Friedman recognized, with the practiced eye of the professional codebreaker, that the C-38 security depended heavily on how its users configured the pin settings on its rotating wheels. A properly randomized configuration produced a cipher sequence of extraordinary length and complexity. But an improperly configured machine, one with pins set in patterns that reduced the effective key space, could be significantly more vulnerable than its theoretical maximum suggested. He raised this with Hagelin not as a criticism but as an engineering observation, the kind of collegial technical discussion that took place between two men who respected each other's expertise and shared a common language of mechanical precision. The subsequent licensing agreement between Hagelin and the United States Army was structured on commercial terms that reflected the genuine value of what was being offered. The Army would manufacture the C-38 under the designation M209 through American contractors, paying Hagelin a royalty for each unit produced. The numbers that followed were staggering. In the course of the Second World War, American manufacturers produced approximately 140,000 M209 machines. At a royalty that worked out to approximately $5 per unit, the precise figures vary across different accounts of the arrangement. Boris Hagelin earned something in the range of $700,000 from the American military's use of his design, a sum that represented considerable wealth in the currency values of the mid-1940s, and that would form the financial foundation on which his post-war business was eventually built. The M209 went to war in the hands of American soldiers across every theater of operations. It was carried by signalmen in North Africa and Italy, in the Pacific Islands and in the hedgerows of Normandy. It encoded tactical messages between company and battalion headquarters, between artillery units and infantry commands, between the 1,001 nodes of modern military communication that required security without the luxury of fixed cipher rooms and trained cryptographic clerks. It was a practical machine for a practical war, compact and reliable, capable of being operated by soldiers whose primary expertise was not cryptography but whatever their military occupational specialty required them to do in the middle of a firefight. The Germans, who had sophisticated cryptanalytic capabilities of their own, were aware of the M209 and devoted resources to attacking it. They had at least partial success. Analysts working for German signals intelligence services recovered some M209 traffic during the war, exploiting the tendency of American operators to use non-random pin configurations and to encipher messages with procedural patterns that reduced the effective key space below the machine's theoretical maximum. This was, in retrospect, precisely the vulnerability that William Friedman had identified during his initial evaluation of the C-38 in Washington, a vulnerability rooted not in the machine's design but in the human element of its operation. The lesson was not lost on Friedman or on the American cryptanalytic establishment, which would carry forward from the M209 experience a very specific understanding of how the gap between a cipher machine's theoretical security and its practical security could be exploited by a patient and sophisticated adversary. Boris Hagelin spent the war years in the United States, overseeing the American production of his machine design and maintaining the kind of technical liaison relationship with the Army Signal Intelligence Service that kept him in regular contact with Friedman and his colleagues. He was, during this period, exactly what he appeared to be, a Swedish businessman and inventor who had chosen to work with the American military because he believed in the Allied cause and because the United States represented the commercial opportunity and the political safety that wartime Europe could no longer offer. He was not an intelligence officer. He was not a spy. He was an engineer with strong anti-fascist convictions and an extremely valuable product in a world suddenly very willing to pay for it. But the relationship he was forming with the American signals intelligence establishment was becoming something more layered than a simple commercial arrangement, even if neither party was quite ready to acknowledge it in those terms. Friedman, who had spent his career studying how cryptographic systems could be made and then broken, worked closely with Hagelin on questions that went beyond the immediate requirements of M209 production. They discussed the long-term development of cipher machine technology. They considered the post-war landscape, the likely shape of future communication security requirements, and the competitive environment that Hagelin would face when he returned to Europe and rebuilt his company. These were the kinds of conversations that two men have when they have developed genuine mutual respect, when they recognize in each other a depth of technical understanding that makes extended technical conversation genuinely rewarding rather than merely obligatory. The friendship that grew between them, and it was a friendship, by the accounts of those who observed it, as genuine as any relationship formed in the urgent crucible of wartime professional collaboration, would eventually become the mechanism through which the CIA's long infiltration of crypto AG began. Neither man was thinking in those terms in 1944 or 1945. They were thinking about the war, about the machines, about the fascinating mathematical and mechanical puzzles that cipher design presented to minds trained to engage with them at the highest level. The war ended in 1945, and Boris Hagelin began making preparations to return to Europe. He had money, experience, a proven commercial product, and a series of ideas for further development of his cipher machine technology that he was eager to pursue. He also had a relationship with William Friedman and the American signals intelligence community that was warm, collegial, and, in the years ahead, about to become something considerably more complicated. The world was reorganizing itself into new structures of power and suspicion, and the machines that Boris Hagelin made were about to become far more significant and far more contested than they had ever been before. The Europe that Boris Hagelin returned to in the years after the Second World War was a continent physically shattered and politically reconfigured in ways that nobody standing amid the rubble of 1945 could quite yet measure. Cities that had been centers of civilization for centuries lay in varying degrees of ruin. The political map had been redrawn in ways that the peace conferences were still formalizing. And the Grand Alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was already fracturing along the seams of ideology and strategic interest that had always been present but had been held together, with enormous effort, for the duration of the fighting. The Cold War, as it came to be called, did not announce itself with a particular declaration or a specific incident. It emerged gradually through a series of confrontations, misunderstandings, and deliberate provocations that accumulated over the late 1940s into a recognizable pattern. Two nuclear-armed superpowers facing each other across a divided continent, each convinced of the other's malign intentions, each constructing the institutional architecture, military alliances, intelligence agencies, propaganda operations, proxy conflicts, necessary to compete in a long struggle whose outcome no one could predict. For a man who built cipher machines, this geopolitical environment was the equivalent of a gold rush. The Cold War was, among other things, an information war, a contest in which both sides devoted enormous resources to the collection of intelligence about the other's military capabilities, political intentions, and economic conditions, and enormous further resources to protecting their own communications from precisely the same kind of collection. Every government that found itself drawn into the contest, whether as a major power or a smaller state caught in the gravitational field of superpower competition, suddenly needed to think seriously about how it communicated, how it sent messages between its embassies and its capitals, between its military commands and its field units, between its intelligence services and the agents they ran in foreign countries. Boris Hagelin understood this need with the clarity of someone who had spent his career selling into exactly this market. He also understood, after years in the United States, the specific requirements of the American intelligence community, what it valued in cipher technology, what it worried about, and what kinds of vulnerabilities it sought to exploit in the systems of its adversaries. This knowledge gave him a framework for thinking about his post-war business that went considerably beyond the simple commercial instincts of a man trying to sell products to willing buyers. His choice of Switzerland as the home for his rebuilt company was deliberate and strategic in ways that extended beyond its famous political neutrality. Switzerland offered practical advantages that were difficult to replicate elsewhere. A stable banking system, a sophisticated industrial workforce accustomed to precision manufacturing, a legal environment that was generally favorable to international commerce, and a tax regime that made it an attractive domicile for profitable foreign trade. But Switzerland's most valuable asset, from the perspective of a man selling encryption equipment to foreign governments, was its reputation, the accumulated weight of centuries of official neutrality, of watched-over border crossings and banking confidentiality and diplomatic discretion, that made the phrase Swiss-made a shorthand for trustworthiness in the minds of buyers who might otherwise have been quite reasonably suspicious of an encryption vendor with American wartime connections. Hagelin incorporated his company in the canton of Zug in the late 1940s, choosing a small lakeside city whose combination of industrial infrastructure and cantonal tax advantages had already begun attracting foreign businesses seeking a Swiss base of operations. Zug was quiet, orderly, and prosperous in the way of prosperous Swiss places. A city of neat streets, church steeples rising above red-roofed buildings, and the cool, clear lake that gave the canton its character. The company Hagelin established there, which he registered formally under the name Crypto AG in 1952, occupied modest premises that suggested a business of craft and precision rather than industrial scale. The name itself, Aktiebolaget Kryptotechnik, had been the Swedish predecessor's designation, but the new Swiss entity took the cleaner, more internationally resonant name of Crypto AG, was chosen with the same attention to commercial presentation that characterized every aspect of how Hagelin positioned his enterprise. The first years in Zug were years of rebuilding and reestablishment. Hagelin worked on refining his machine designs, updating the post-war models with improvements that reflected both his own evolving technical thinking and the feedback he had received from American and other military customers about what was working and what was not. The Cold War world was generating new customers at a pace that exceeded even his optimistic projections. As newly independent nations emerged from the ruins of European colonial empires, as old established governments modernized their communication infrastructure, as military establishments across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East sought to acquire the equipment of professional modern armed forces, the list of countries that needed reliable cipher machines grew longer and more diverse with each passing year. By the early 1950s, Crypto AG machines were being sold to the foreign ministries and military establishments of nations as far-flung as the countries of the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. The variety of clients was itself part of the company's commercial argument. If countries on every continent, with governments of every political orientation, trusted Crypto AG equipment to protect their most sensitive communications, then surely the machines were the genuine article, independent, reliable, protected by the same Swiss neutrality that made Geneva the home of the Red Cross and the host of diplomatic conferences between parties who would not meet in each other's capitals. Not all of this growth was purely organic. The American intelligence community, which had maintained its relationship with Hagelin through the post-war years via the ongoing connection between Hagelin and William Friedman, was paying active attention to who was buying Crypto AG machines and for what purposes. Signals intelligence collection, the interception and analysis of foreign communications, was, in the Cold War context, enormously valuable, but it was only as valuable as the communications could be decoded. The best signals collection in the world produced nothing but meaningless cipher text if the analysts could not break the encryption. The question of what cipher machines foreign governments were using was therefore not a matter of casual curiosity to the American intelligence establishment. It was a question of fundamental operational importance. Hagelin himself was navigating his own version of this tension. He had genuine, deep anti-communist convictions, formed partly through his background as a Swedish engineer with Eastern European experience and partly through years of living in the United States during the war and absorbing the very American sense of what was at stake in the ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. He believed, in the way that people with strong political convictions during the Cold War period often did, that the Western alliance was fighting a defensive war against an adversarial ideology that threatened everything he valued, and that contributing to Western intelligence capabilities was a form of patriotism, even if the country in question was not technically his own. This conviction made him susceptible to the argument that would eventually be made to him, or susceptible might be too weak a word, since some accounts suggest he was an active participant in shaping the arrangement rather than simply a willing recruit. The intelligence community's pitch to Hagelin was not framed as a request to betray his customers. It was framed as a contribution to Cold War security, as a recognition that certain customers, the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and the nations aligned with or sympathetic to Moscow, should not benefit from the same level of cryptographic protection that America's allies received. The argument drew a distinction between Hagelin's commercial clients and the strategic adversaries of the West, and it asked him to honor that distinction by ensuring that the machines sold to adversary states were not truly as secure as they appeared. The full terms of what was agreed, the specific technical nature of the arrangement, and exactly how the relationship between Hagelin and the CIA was structured in these early years are matters that the documentary record, even after the 2020 revelations, does not fully resolve. What is clear is that by the early 1950s, the relationship between Boris Hagelin and the American intelligence community had evolved well beyond the friendly professional connection of wartime collaboration. Something was being arranged. Something that would have consequences far beyond what either party was thinking about in those early conversations, in those discreet meetings between a Swiss-based engineer and American officials who traveled to Europe with purposes that were never fully described in official travel records. The post-war years in Zug were, on the surface, the years of a successful businessman at the height of his powers. A man watching his company grow, his products win market share, his reputation extend around the world. Beneath the surface, an architecture was being constructed that would outlast him by decades, persisting long after he had retired to his comfortable lakeside home and long after the gentleman's agreement that initiated it had been replaced by something far more formal and far more difficult to unwind. The world, in the early 1950s, was divided in ways that seemed permanent. The Korean War was being fought. The Soviet Union had detonated an atomic bomb. The competition between the two superpowers had acquired the dimensions of a civilizational contest. And in Zug, Switzerland, a cipher machine company was quietly growing into the most important passive intelligence asset on the planet, even if its owner had not yet fully appreciated, or perhaps had chosen not to fully articulate to himself, exactly what he had agreed to. The year 1951 was, in the history of the Cold War intelligence contest, a year of escalating anxiety on both sides of the divide. The Korean War was consuming American military resources and testing the limits of alliance cohesion. The Soviet Union had demonstrated its nuclear capability 2 years earlier with a test that ended American atomic monopoly and fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of every planning document in the Pentagon. In Western Europe, the reconstruction that American money had funded through the Marshall Plan was producing economic recovery, but the political situation remained fragile. Communist parties commanded significant electoral support in France and Italy, and the question of whether Western Europe was truly secured for democracy was far from settled in the minds of the men running American foreign policy. In this environment, the gathering of intelligence about Soviet intentions and capabilities was not merely desirable. It was, in the view of the American intelligence community and the senior officials who directed it, a matter of national survival. The CIA, founded in 1947 and still in the process of building its institutional identity and operational capacity, was expanding its work on every front. Recruiting agents in Eastern Europe, running propaganda operations, building liaison relationships with the intelligence services of Western allies, and fundamentally reassessing the signals intelligence architecture that the wartime partnership with the British had produced. The question of cipher machines was at the center of that reassessment. American signals collection capabilities were generating enormous volumes of intercepted foreign communications traffic. The problem was that many of the most important governments, the ones whose intentions the CIA and the National Security Agency most wanted to understand, were encrypting their communications with machines and systems that American analysts could not readily solve. The Soviet Union used its own cipher systems, heavily protected and partially resistant to the mathematical attacks that American expertise could mount. But many second-tier governments, the countries of the Middle East, the new nations of Asia and Africa, the military regimes of Latin America, were acquiring their cipher equipment from commercial sources, and the commercial cipher machine market was still small enough that the right intervention at the right point could potentially give American intelligence an extraordinary window into the communications of dozens of governments simultaneously. William Friedman, by 1951, had been thinking about this problem for years. He understood cipher machine design at a fundamental level that few people on Earth could match, and he understood the specific technical architectures that would make a machine vulnerable to analysis while still appearing, to any ordinary evaluation, to be highly secure. He also understood Boris Hagelin, having maintained the relationship forged during the war years through periodic correspondence and occasional visits. Friedman knew that Hagelin was ideologically sympathetic to the Western cause, that he had strong personal antipathy toward Soviet communism, and that he was a man who thought carefully about the broader implications of his work and could be engaged in a serious conversation about the intersection of cipher technology and geopolitics. The meeting that took place between Hagelin and Friedman in the early 1950s, the accounts in the CIA's internal history and other sources are somewhat imprecise about whether this was a single definitive encounter or a series of conversations across multiple meetings, though it seems most likely to have involved a face-to-face discussion in Europe sometime around 1951, would prove to be the foundational moment of everything that followed. The precise location of the meeting is not reliably established in the public record, but the general structure of what was discussed and agreed can be reconstructed from the documentary evidence that became available after 2020. Friedman came to Hagelin with a proposal. He did not present it as a request for Hagelin to betray his customers or compromise his company's integrity. He framed it, according to the available accounts, in the language of alliance and shared purpose, the same framing that had characterized their wartime relationship. The argument went roughly as follows. The United States and its Western allies were engaged in a long-term competition with an adversary that did not observe the ordinary rules of commercial relationships, that was actively seeking to penetrate Western communications and intelligence operations through every means available, and that would gain a significant and dangerous advantage if its own client states and allies were able to use cipher equipment that American analysts could not solve. Hagelin, by selling his machines to governments aligned with or sympathetic to the Soviet bloc, was potentially providing cover communications capability to the adversary. The request was that he make an adjustment, that machines sold to certain categories of customers, governments identified by American intelligence as adversaries or potential adversaries, be configured differently from those sold to Western-aligned governments, in ways that would preserve the appearance of full security while reducing the actual security to a level that American cryptanalysts could address. For Hagelin, who was genuinely committed to the Western alliance and who had spent the formative years of his mature professional life in the company of American military and intelligence professionals, the argument had real force. He was not being asked to spy for money. He was not being recruited as a mercenary intelligence asset. He was being invited to make a contribution to a cause he already believed in, through means that required only a modest technical adjustment to products he was already selling, to customers who had no particular claim on his loyalty or his conscience. The adversary nations that would receive weakened machines were not his friends. They were the governments whose ideology he found threatening and whose communications, if decipherable by Western analysts, might well prevent the kind of conflict that had already cost the world so much in the previous decade. The moral architecture of this argument, examined from outside, has some significant gaps. Hagelin was, after all, selling his machines commercially, which meant that buyers in every category were paying for a product they had every right to expect was genuinely what it claimed to be. The governments that sent their most sensitive communications over crypto AG machines had entered into a commercial relationship premised on honest dealing. The Swiss neutrality that made Hagelin's company attractive to buyers who would never have purchased from an American or British manufacturer was itself a form of implicit assurance. An assurance that the product's integrity was not subordinated to the political preferences of any particular government or alliance. But Boris Hagelin, like many people who find themselves at the intersection of commerce and ideology during periods of acute geopolitical tension, may have found it easier to see the argument that served his existing convictions than the argument that complicated them. He was a man who had fled a continent collapsing under fascism, who had spent years working alongside officers and analysts who defined their purpose as the defense of civilization, and who had developed a personal philosophy in which the boundaries between his professional identity and his political identity were less distinct than they might have been for someone without his particular history. The arrangement that Friedman and Hagelin reached, described in some accounts as a gentleman's agreement and in others as a more formal understanding documented in some form of written record that has not been fully disclosed, established the basic structure that would operate for the next 2 decades. Crypto AG would sell cipher machines to any commercial customer, as it had been doing, and Hagelin would not interfere with sales to Western allied governments, whose machines would provide genuine security. But for governments identified by American intelligence as adversary or non-aligned states, the machines produced would incorporate specific technical characteristics that reduced their cryptographic strength, characteristics that were invisible to the end user and undetectable by any evaluation that did not involve knowledge of exactly what to look for. In exchange, Hagelin received arrangements that were described, in the various accounts that have emerged, as including financial compensation in the form of consulting fees and licensing arrangements, as well as certain commercial considerations that benefited Crypto AG in its dealings with governments where American influence could be usefully applied. The CIA, by some accounts, actively facilitated introductions to potential Crypto AG customers in regions where American diplomatic and commercial networks could open doors, effectively functioning as a silent sales force for a company it was simultaneously exploiting. Whether Hagelin fully understood or acknowledged to himself the full extent of this arrangement, including the specific nature of the technical compromises that would be made to machines sold to adversary governments, is a question that the available historical record does not resolve with complete clarity. What the record does establish beyond any reasonable doubt is that by the early 1950s, the basic architecture of Operation Rubicon was in place, even if the formal name and the institutional structure that would eventually govern it were still years away from being defined. An American intelligence official with unmatched expertise in cipher machine design had reached an agreement with the world's most commercially successful cipher machine manufacturer. The agreement provided that the manufacturer would produce products calibrated to serve two different levels of actual security, regardless of what any marketing material said. And the manufacturer would continue to grow, building a client list and a commercial reputation that would extend the reach of American intelligence collection in ways that no other instrument in the intelligence toolkit could have matched. The gentleman who made that agreement understood the nature of power, the demands of ideology, and the compromise that wartime experience had taught them both was sometimes unavoidable. What they may not have fully reckoned with was the scale of what they had put in motion, the decades of governments deceived, the intelligence operations enabled, and the eventual public accounting that would come long after both of them were gone. The headquarters of Crypto AG in Zug occupied, through most of the 1950s and 1960s, a set of premises that were distinguished primarily by their orderliness and their discretion. The building did not announce itself. There was no illuminated sign visible from the street, no lobby designed to impress visiting clients, no architectural statement about the company's ambitions or its place in the world. What visitors found, if they found it at all, was a clean, well-maintained Swiss commercial building staffed by Swiss professionals who spoke quietly, worked precisely, and kept their personal assessments of customers' national politics entirely to themselves. This was, in every visible respect, a model Swiss company, a business so thoroughly absorbed into the culture of Swiss commercial professionalism that its employees would have considered the phrase Swiss discretion a statement of redundancy. The workforce that Hagelin had assembled by the mid-1950s was composed primarily of Swiss engineers, machinists, administrative staff, and sales personnel whose expertise was in the mechanics of precision manufacturing and the challenges of selling technically complex products to clients with demanding specifications. Most of them had no knowledge of, and no reason to suspect, the arrangement that their employer had reached with American intelligence. They came to work, produced cipher machines to the specifications they were given, ensured that quality control standards were met, and went home to the domestic lives of Swiss professionals whose careers happened to involve the manufacture of something their government's clients genuinely valued. The sales force was particularly important to Crypto AG's growth in this period. Selling cipher machines required a specific kind of commercial skill, the ability to navigate the bureaucratic structures of foreign military establishments and foreign ministries, to establish credibility with government officials who were by nature and training cautious about what they purchased and from whom, and to represent a product whose technical complexity was formidable enough that potential customers needed both demonstration and reassurance before they committed to acquisition. The Crypto AG salesman of the 1950s and 1960s was a well-dressed, well-traveled, multilingual professional who cultivated long-term relationships with government procurement officials in a dozen countries simultaneously, building the kind of institutional trust that generated not just initial sales but the ongoing contracts for maintenance, spare parts, and equipment upgrades that provided Crypto AG with a steady commercial base. The company's growth through this period was remarkable by any standard of commercial success, but it was remarkable in a particular way. It was cumulative and self-reinforcing in a manner that most commercial businesses can only aspire to. Once a government purchased crypto AG machines for its foreign ministry and trained its cipher clerks to use them, the switching costs of moving to a different system were substantial. Protocol files, key settings, operator training, spare parts inventories, all of these accumulated into a kind of institutional inertia that made the relationship between crypto AG and its government clients stickier than ordinary commercial relationships between a vendor and a buyer. Governments did not frequently change their cipher machine suppliers the way a business might change its office furniture supplier. The decision to buy crypto AG equipment was a long-term institutional commitment, and the company's sales strategy emphasized building the kind of deep relationship that made renewal and expansion the path of least resistance. By the early 1960s, crypto AG machines were in use in the foreign ministries of dozens of countries. They were encrypting the communications of governments in the Middle East, where the post-colonial redrawing of borders had created a series of new states that needed the entire apparatus of modern national government, including secure communication infrastructure. They were in use in Latin America, where military governments and civilian democracies alike relied on them for both diplomatic communication and military command traffic. They were spreading through Africa as decolonization produced new nations at a rate that the international community could barely track, each one needing to establish the institutional infrastructure of independent statehood. And they were in use in parts of Asia where the Cold War was playing out most violently, in the proxy conflicts and political instabilities that the superpower competition was generating across the continent. Hagelin's own role in the company evolved as it grew. He remained the central technical figure, the person who drove the continuing development of new machine designs, and who maintained the intellectual authority that defined crypto AG's competitive position. The company's machines did not stand still. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Hagelin and his engineers worked through multiple generations of design, incorporating new materials, new manufacturing techniques, and the gradual integration of electronic components as transistor technology began to supplement and in some cases replace purely mechanical solutions. The Hagelin C52 and CX52 models that appeared in the 1950s were improvements on the earlier mechanical designs, offering longer key sequences and greater operational flexibility without abandoning the basic mechanical architecture that had proven its reliability in field conditions worldwide. The CX52 in particular became one of crypto AG's most important products. It retained the pin and lug mechanism that was Hagelin's signature contribution to cipher design, but refined it in ways that made the machine more versatile and more resistant to the kinds of procedural errors that field operators tended to make. It was sold to a long list of governments throughout the Cold War period and remained in widespread use well into the 1970s. The CIA's ability to read communications encrypted on CX52 machines, an ability that rested on knowledge of the specific vulnerabilities built into the versions sold to adversary governments, was a sustained intelligence windfall that persisted across multiple decades of Cold War competition. The employees of Crypto AG who built and serviced these machines had no reason to suspect any of this. Their professional world was bounded by the engineering drawings on their drafting tables, the quality specifications they were required to meet, and the customer service obligations that arose when machines in the field developed problems. They took pride in the quality of Swiss manufacturing, in the global reputation of the company they worked for, in the professional satisfaction of producing precision instruments that governments around the world trusted with their most sensitive communications. The gap between that professional pride and the moral reality of the arrangement their employer had made with American intelligence was a gap that none of them were equipped to see or to close, because none of them knew it existed. Boris Hagelin himself, as the 1960s advanced, was moving toward the latter decades of a long and extraordinary life. He was in his 70s, still intellectually engaged with the technical problems of cipher design, but increasingly delegating the operational management of the company to the people he had brought in to run its day-to-day functions. He maintained his personal relationship with the American intelligence community, and by accounts available from the 2020 revelations, continued to receive various forms of compensation and consideration that reflected the value of the arrangement he had established. He lived well in Switzerland, respected in Zug's business community, recognized in the specialized world of cryptographic engineering as the dominant figure of the mechanical cipher machine era. He was, by any external measure, a successful and contented man. What he may have been internally, in the quiet hours between social engagements and technical reviews, is harder to assess. The philosophical gap between his self-image as a contributor to Western security and the commercial reality of selling government's products that were secretly engineered to fail them was a gap that he would have needed to navigate with some care if he thought about it in those terms at all. Perhaps he didn't. Perhaps the ideological framing of the original agreement, that this was a contribution to a necessary Cold War balance of power, was sufficient to absorb whatever moral discomfort the arrangement might otherwise have generated. The Cold War was full of people who convinced themselves that extraordinary means were justified by extraordinary ends, and Boris Hagelin, who had shaped his political consciousness against the backdrop of fascism's rise and the West's long struggle against it, was in many ways an ideal candidate for that kind of conviction. The 1960s brought changes to the competitive landscape of the cipher machine industry. A German company called Siemens was developing its own encryption products. The Americans had their own secure communications systems for their most sensitive traffic. And there was always the theoretical possibility that a customer somewhere would take a crypto AG machine apart in a sufficiently sophisticated way and notice something that wasn't supposed to be noticed. The CIA, watching all of this from Fort Meade and Langley, periodically assessed the risks of exposure and made operational adjustments accordingly. The arrangement with Hagelin was, by the standards of intelligence operations, extraordinarily well insulated from discovery. It rested on a commercial relationship that looked entirely innocent from the outside, produced no operational footprint of the kind that human intelligence operations tend to create, and was protected by the institutional authority of a man who had every incentive to maintain his silence. But as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, new pressures were building that would require the arrangement to be placed on a more formal footing. Boris Hagelin was aging. The gentleman's agreement that had structured the operation since 1951 rested, ultimately, on one extraordinary human being. And extraordinary human beings, however reliable, do not live forever. The year 1970 arrived with a particular kind of Cold War grimness. The Vietnam War was consuming American credibility as fast as it consumed American lives. The Prague Spring had been crushed 2 years earlier under Soviet tanks, reminding anyone who needed reminding of the ruthlessness with which Moscow maintained its sphere of influence. Student protests were spreading across Western Europe and North America. The certainties of the post-war American order, the institutional confidence that had authorized everything from the Marshall Plan to the Bay of Pigs, were eroding under the pressure of events that no amount of institutional authority could fully contain. Inside the American intelligence community, the pressures were different but no less acute. The CIA was navigating the political consequences of failed operations and expanding congressional scrutiny of its activities. The NSA was managing the enormous operational challenge of processing the volumes of signals intelligence its collection apparatus was generating, in an era when computation was expensive, storage was limited, and the ability to turn raw intercept traffic into usable intelligence required enormous analytical resources. Against this backdrop, the arrangement with Crypto AG, the arrangement that had been generating intelligence dividends since the early 1950s, was both more valuable and more fragile than it had ever been. It was more valuable because Crypto AG's commercial success had by 1970 made it the single most important source of cipher equipment for a wide range of governments that America most needed to understand. More than 100 countries were now using Crypto AG machines for their most sensitive communications. The traffic flowing through those machines, traffic that American analysts were reading in something approaching real time, after the cryptographic weaknesses built into the machines had been exploited, represented an intelligence collection capability that would have taken thousands of human agents, working across dozens of countries simultaneously, to approximate through any other means. It was more fragile because Boris Hagelin was 77 years old. The arrangement that generated all of this intelligence rested, ultimately, on the personal commitment of one man rather than on any institutional structure that would survive his incapacity or his death. If Hagelin were to die or become incapacitated, or if he were to undergo a change of heart about the arrangement and communicate its existence to outside parties, the entire program could unravel with a speed that would leave the American intelligence community in a very difficult position. The operational exposure was compounded by a personal dimension. Hagelin's son, Martin Hagelin, who had been positioned as the likely successor to his father's control of the company, died in a car accident in the United States in 1970. The path of succession at Crypto AG had suddenly become uncertain in a way that made the vulnerability of the gentleman's agreement concrete and immediate. The CIA's response to this situation was characteristically operational. If the arrangement could not be reliably maintained through the personal connection to Hagelin alone, then the arrangement needed to be formalized through a mechanism that would outlast the personal relationship. The solution that emerged from discussions between the CIA and its closest European intelligence partner, the BND of West Germany, was essentially straightforward in concept even if complex in execution. Purchase Crypto AG outright, through a concealed ownership structure, and thereby ensure permanent control over the company, its products, its technical development, and its customer relationships. The West German BND's participation in the arrangement reflected both the partnership's history and its present utility. West Germany had been a close intelligence ally of the United States since the early years of the Federal Republic, with the BND maintaining a particularly close working relationship with the CIA that bore the marks, and sometimes the complications, of a patron-client dynamic. For the BND, participation in the Crypto AG ownership arrangement offered a specific operational benefit. West Germany's position as a major European economy with extensive commercial and diplomatic relationships across the developing world gave the BND, and by extension the American intelligence community, a cover story for the company's commercial presence that benefited from German, rather than purely American, association. A cipher machine company with German engineering credentials and Swiss incorporation was easier to sell to certain markets than one with any American association attached, however indirect. The negotiations for the purchase were conducted with the kind of care that operations of this sensitivity require: multiple intermediaries, a legal structure designed to produce as many layers of separation between the true owners and the visible commercial entity as possible. The ownership of Crypto AG was transferred to a holding company incorporated in the Principality of Liechtenstein, the small independent territory sandwiched between Switzerland and Austria, whose legal and financial infrastructure had long made it a favored location for arrangements that required a degree of distance between beneficial owners and public records. The Liechtenstein holding company, in turn, was owned by arrangements that obscured the ultimate beneficial interest behind layers of corporate formality that met the legal requirements of the jurisdictions involved while making direct attribution essentially impossible for anyone without access to documents that were themselves classified. The purchase price that the CIA and BND paid for Crypto AG has been reported, based on the documents that became public in 2020, at approximately $5.75 million, a figure that, measured against the intelligence value that the operation had already generated and would continue to generate, represented one of the most cost-effective acquisitions in intelligence history. Boris Hagelin received a life annuity as part of the transaction, providing him with a comfortable income for the remainder of his years. He stepped back from active management of the company, retaining an honorary position that acknowledged his founding role while transferring operational control to management that the new owners had approved. The technical direction of the company, specifically the engineering decisions that determined what cipher algorithms were built into new machine designs, what key space those algorithms provided to users, and what vulnerabilities were deliberately incorporated to allow American and German analysts to solve the cipher text, passed to a management team that understood the dual nature of the product they were producing. Not all of Crypto AG's employees were aware of the full reality of the ownership structure or the technical compromises built into the machines. The company continued to function as a normal commercial enterprise in most respects, with most employees doing exactly the work they believed they were doing, building precision instruments that their customers trusted with their most sensitive communications. The executives and senior engineers who did understand the arrangement understood it in the compartmentalized way that intelligence operations of this kind require, each person knowing what they needed to know to perform their specific function, without necessarily having visibility into the full scope of the program or the identity of all the parties involved. The CIA officers assigned to manage the Crypto AG account maintained their relationship with company management through the kind of discreet ongoing contact that could, if examined from outside, be attributed to any number of legitimate commercial or technical purposes. The code name that the CIA applied to the phase of the operation following the 1970 purchase was Thesaurus, later superseded by the designation Rubicon, a name drawn from Julius Caesar's famous crossing of the river that Roman law required generals to cross unarmed, the crossing that committed him irrevocably to civil war. The choice of that name, cited in the CIA's internal documents, suggested an institutional recognition that the 1970 purchase had placed the agency on the far side of a line from which there could be no casual return. Once you owned the world's leading encryption company and were supplying secretly weakened cipher machines to more than 100 foreign governments, the commitment was total. The option of simply walking away, of deciding that the moral or operational costs had become too high, was not really an option at all. The scale of the enterprise that the CIA and BND had formalized through the 1970 purchase was genuinely extraordinary, and it is worth pausing to appreciate what they had actually acquired. Crypto AG's commercial position in the cipher machine market was not merely strong. It was, for many categories of government customer, effectively monopolistic. Governments that had built their secure communication infrastructure around Crypto AG machines over the preceding decade or two had invested not just money but institutional knowledge and procedural routine in those machines. Their cipher clerks knew how to operate them. Their technical staff knew how to maintain them. Their procurement officers had supplier relationships with Crypto AG representatives who had, in many cases, become personally known and professionally trusted over years of commercial interaction. The switching costs of moving to a different supplier were substantial, and in the absence of any compelling reason to make that change, most customers simply continued to buy from the vendor they had always bought from. This institutional inertia was, from the CIA's perspective, a continuing dividend on the initial investment. Every year that Crypto AG retained its existing customers was a year of sustained intelligence collection at a level that no other passive intelligence program could match. Every new government that chose Crypto AG for the first time was a new member of the pool of governments whose communications were, from that day forward, accessible to American analysts. And every new machine model that Crypto AG introduced, with the technical adjustments that CIA and BND technical advisors approved as part of their management role, was another generation of compromised equipment that extended the program's reach into future years. Boris Hagelin died in December 1983 in Zug, at the age of 91, having lived long enough to see the company he had built become something far larger and more consequential than the modest precision manufacturing business he had originally envisioned. He is buried in Zug. The company whose products carried his design philosophy continued to operate long after him, owned by intelligence agencies he had welcomed as partners, selling the cipher machines he had invented to the governments he had never quite brought himself to fully acknowledge he was betraying. To understand what the CIA and BND had actually bought when they acquired Crypto AG in 1970, and what the arrangement produced in practical terms, it is necessary to spend some time with the technical reality of cipher machine design, not at the level of advanced mathematics but at the level of the conceptual problem that every cipher machine is trying to solve, and the specific way in which that problem's solution can be secretly subverted while maintaining all the outward appearances of genuine security. The fundamental challenge of mechanical cipher design is the challenge of randomness. A cipher is secure when the relationship between the plain text and the encrypted output is so complex and unpredictable that an adversary who intercepts the ciphertext cannot work backward from the output to the input without knowledge of the specific key used to produce it. The ideal cipher generates an output that is, to any external observer without knowledge of the key, indistinguishable from random noise. There is no pattern, no statistical regularity, no structural feature that bears any consistent relationship to the underlying message. Such a cipher, properly implemented with a truly random key, is mathematically unbreakable, a fact that had been established by the American mathematician Claude Shannon in 1949, in a paper that defined the theoretical foundations of cryptographic security in terms that the field had not previously possessed. The problem with mechanical cipher machines is that they do not produce truly random output. They produce output that is generated by a deterministic mechanical process, a sequence of rotors or pins or gears turning according to rules that are fixed by the machine's design. The output is not random. It is pseudo-random, meaning it has the statistical appearance of randomness and is computationally difficult to analyze, but it is in principle susceptible to attack by anyone who knows enough about the underlying mechanism to apply the right mathematical tools. The security of a mechanical cipher machine, therefore, depends not on true randomness but on computational difficulty, on making the task of attacking the cipher sufficiently complex that an adversary without the key would need more time and more computational resources than any practical attack could muster. The key variable in this equation is the length and complexity of the cipher's key cycle, the period after which the mechanical sequence of the machine begins to repeat. A short key cycle produces output with repeating patterns that a skilled analyst can identify and exploit. A very long key cycle, one that, say, does not repeat for a period longer than the total amount of text a government will ever encrypt with a given key setting, is immune to pattern analysis in practical terms. Boris Hagelin's pin and lug mechanism was specifically designed to produce key cycles of extraordinary length, and in properly configured machines sold to customers who set up their pin configurations at random, those cycles were long enough to provide genuine security against the analytical tools available throughout the Cold War period. The CIA's technical adjustment to this arrangement was, in concept, straightforward: reduce the effective key cycle length for machines destined for adversary governments, in ways that were invisible to the end user and that would not be detected by any ordinary evaluation of the machine's design. A crypto AG machine built to the publicly described specifications might have a theoretical key cycle of, say, several hundred million positions. A machine with a subtle internal modification might have an effective key cycle of only a few tens of thousands of positions, still long enough that a naive test of the machine's output would appear to pass, but short enough that an analyst equipped with the right tools and a sufficient sample of ciphertext could recover the key and read the underlying message. The specific techniques used to achieve this reduction in effective security changed across the decades as the machines evolved from purely mechanical designs to hybrid electromechanical devices and eventually to electronic systems. In the earlier period, the modifications involved specific adjustments to the pin configurations permitted to certain customer categories, or to the internal mechanical relationships between the machine's components that affected the statistical properties of the output in ways that only someone who knew what to look for would detect. In later periods, as electronic components became central to the machine's operation, the modifications could be implemented through circuit design choices that produced algorithmically predictable output for the agency that knew the underlying algorithm while appearing to any external evaluation to be a securely random cipher system. The personnel at Crypto AG who designed and built these machines occupied a carefully managed spectrum of knowledge. At the top of the hierarchy, a small number of senior engineers and executives understood the dual-purpose nature of what they were producing and were accountable to the CIA and BND management that oversaw the operation. Below them, the engineers responsible for implementing specific technical designs worked from specifications they were given, in the ordinary way of professional engineers who implement designs they did not originate. Further down still, the manufacturing workforce built what the engineering drawings specified, without needing to understand the strategic significance of any particular component relationship. The need-to-know principle had been applied with the precision that intelligence professionals brought to the management of sensitive operations. The result was a company that looked, to any ordinary external examination, exactly like what it claimed to be: a Swiss precision instrument manufacturer producing world-class cipher machines for a global market. The products were genuine. The manufacturing was excellent. The customer service was professional and responsive. The Swiss employees who staffed the company brought to their work the quality consciousness and the attention to detail that Swiss manufacturing traditions valued. None of this was a pretense. Crypto AG made genuinely good machines. They were just not, for certain customers, genuinely secure ones. The intelligence that flowed from this arrangement, once the CIA and BND had formalized their control, arrived at the NSA's processing centers in volumes that would have been difficult to generate through any other collection method. The range of governments whose communications were being read included most of the world's non-aligned and Soviet sympathetic states, along with a number of governments that were nominally Western-aligned but whose internal communications were of operational interest for reasons that had nothing to do with the Cold War balance of power. The collection was indiscriminate in the sense that it targeted entire categories of government traffic rather than specific operations or specific individuals, which meant that alongside communications of extraordinary strategic significance, The analysts processing crypto AG intercepts were reading enormous volumes of routine diplomatic traffic, trade negotiations, internal government correspondence, and the kind of bureaucratic routine that forms the bulk of what any government communicates. The processing of crypto AG intercepts was, by all accounts available from the 2020 revelations, an operation of remarkable scale and sophistication. The NSA had analysts dedicated specifically to traffic flowing through crypto AG machines, personnel who understood the specific vulnerabilities of each machine model and who had been trained in the analytical techniques necessary to exploit those vulnerabilities efficiently. The turnaround time between interception and readable intelligence product varied by machine model and by the specific nature of the traffic, but the general principle was that a message sent through a crypto AG machine by a foreign government on Monday could be in front of an American decision-maker as usable intelligence by Wednesday, or in some cases faster. The distribution of that intelligence within the American national security community followed the standard compartmentalization protocols that governed all sensitive signals intelligence. Strictly limited dissemination, careful sourcing protection, removal of identifying details that might allow a recipient to work backward to the collection method. An American policymaker reading an intelligence report based on crypto AG traffic would see a document describing foreign government communications in terms that protected the source, making it impossible for the reader to understand that the intelligence had come from a compromised commercial cipher machine rather than from a human agent or a different technical collection platform. The BND, for its part, received access to the intelligence collected through crypto AG machines in the markets where German interests were most directly engaged, principally in the Near East and parts of Africa and Latin America where West German commercial and diplomatic presence was significant. The intelligence partnership between the CIA and BND around the crypto AG program was governed by specific agreements about what each party would receive and under what conditions, though the CIA clearly retained the dominant position in the relationship and maintained ultimate control over the program's technical direction and operational management. The mechanics of this arrangement, the engineering adjustments, the distribution protocols, the institutional management of a decades-long combined commercial and intelligence operation, represent an achievement in the sustained coordination of technical, commercial, and operational elements that is, in its own deeply troubling way, genuinely impressive. It required maintaining consistency across multiple generations of machine design, across multiple management teams at Crypto AG, and across the bureaucratic evolution of the CIA itself through the various reorganizations and leadership changes that characterized the agency over half a century. The intelligence it produced in those decades after 1970 would reach into some of the most consequential events of the Cold War and its aftermath. The governments that trusted crypto AG machines had no idea that their most sensitive communications were being read, and the agencies that read them had every incentive to say nothing. The first major test of what the CIA's crypto AG ownership could produce in practical operational terms came not in the form of a diplomatic triumph or a military victory, but in the form of a crisis that the American government found itself watching from the outside, in agonizing real time, for more than 400 days. On November 4, 1979, a crowd of Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and seized 66 American diplomats and staff as hostages. The taking of the hostages was, in its immediate dimension, an act of political theater, a direct challenge to American power coming in the immediate aftermath of the revolution that had overthrown the Shah and brought Ayatollah Khomeini's government to power. But its implications extended far beyond the immediate confrontation between Washington and Tehran. The hostage crisis consumed the Carter administration's final year, defined the 1980 presidential election, and forced a sustained reassessment of American policy toward the Persian Gulf and toward the broader question of how the United States would manage its relationships with the volatile politics of the post-colonial Middle East. Throughout the crisis, the Iranian government communicated with its embassies, its military commanders, and its diplomatic representatives using cipher machines. A significant proportion of that communication traffic was encrypted on crypto AG equipment, and American intelligence analysts, working with the access that the compromised machines provided, were reading a substantial portion of those communications throughout the hostage crisis, watching in real time as Iranian officials debated diplomatic strategies, assessed American intentions, communicated with intermediaries, and navigated the internal political pressures that made the release of the hostages simultaneously urgent and politically constrained. The intelligence value of this window into Iranian decision-making was immense. It allowed American analysts to assess, with a degree of confidence that no other source could have provided, the sincerity of various diplomatic feelers, the internal Iranian dynamics that were actually governing the pace and conditions of any eventual release, and the specific individuals and factions whose positions were determinative. It did not produce a rapid resolution of the crisis. The forces shaping the Iranian government's behavior were ultimately political and domestic in ways that no amount of intelligence could easily redirect, but it provided a sustained picture of what was actually happening inside a government that American policymakers would otherwise have been largely unable to read. The Falklands War of 1982 produced a different kind of intelligence dividend from the crypto AG program, and one whose operational consequences were more directly traceable. When Argentina, under its military junta, seized the Falkland Islands in April 1982 and Britain responded with a naval task force dispatched to retake them, both countries were operating in a war environment that created urgent demands for signals intelligence. Britain, as a close American intelligence ally operating under the UCUSA agreement that governed the sharing of signals intelligence between Washington, London, Ottawa, Canberra, and Wellington, benefited from American intelligence support throughout the conflict. And a portion of that support came from the ability to read Argentine military communications. The Argentine armed forces used crypto AG cipher machines for portions of their military communication. The compromised machines sold to Argentina fell squarely within the category of adversary or non-allied government traffic that the CIA had identified for weakened security. American analysts were reading Argentine military traffic, and the intelligence they collected was, under the terms of the UCUSA arrangement, shared with British military intelligence. The extent to which this intelligence influenced specific tactical decisions during the Falklands campaign is difficult to document precisely. The military details remain partially classified even after the 2020 revelations, but the access was real, and the general direction of the intelligence sharing that British forces received from their American allies during the conflict was understood, within the relevant intelligence communities, to include material derived from compromised cipher. Communications. The operational payoff from the Libya case in 1986, the intelligence that confirmed Libyan responsibility for the Berlin disco bombing and enabled President Reagan to authorize the airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi, has already been noted. What is worth adding to that account is the sustained nature of the intelligence access that Libyan communications provided through crypto AG in the years surrounding that specific event. For more than a decade, the CIA had been reading Libyan diplomatic and intelligence traffic flowing through machines that the Libyan government believed were protecting its most sensitive communications. The result was a comprehensive picture of Libyan government activities, plans, and decisions that would have been impossible to construct from any other available intelligence source. A picture that contributed directly to the Reagan administration's confidence when it decided to respond to the Berlin bombing with military force. The Iran-Iraq War, which consumed both countries from 1980 through 1988 and drew in the interests of virtually every major power with a stake in Persian Gulf stability, provided another theater in which crypto AG intelligence collection was operational. Both Iran and Iraq were using cipher equipment during the conflict. In Iraq's case, a mixture of systems including machines sold through the Arab world's commercial encryption market, and in Iran's case, equipment that included, at least for some periods and some categories of traffic, machinery that had been acquired from crypto AG or through related supply chains. The American intelligence community's ability to monitor the communications of both belligerents in a war that the Reagan administration was attempting to manage through active, if covert, intervention on the Iraqi side gave American policymakers an intelligence advantage that shaped decisions whose full implications are still being assessed by historians. Beyond these specific high-visibility cases, the crypto AG program was generating intelligence on an effectively continuous basis from more than 100 governments across every region of the world. The bulk of this intelligence fell into the category of ordinary diplomatic traffic, the routine communications that foreign ministries send between their capitals and their ambassadors, covering everything from bilateral trade negotiations to internal personnel matters to the reporting that ambassadors send back from their posts when they want to share their assessments of local conditions. None of this is dramatic, but cumulatively it produces something more valuable than drama. A persistent, comprehensive picture of how dozens of governments are actually thinking, what their real priorities are, where their commitments are genuine and where they are diplomatic performance, and what the actual state of their relationships with each other is beneath the surface of public communication. American policymakers negotiating bilateral agreements with countries that used crypto AG machines were negotiating from an informational position that their counterparts could not have imagined. They knew, because their analysts had read the relevant cables, what the opposing negotiators' actual bottom line was, what concessions they had been authorized to make, what domestic political constraints were genuinely binding and which were being used as tactical positions. They knew in advance which arguments would be persuasive and which would be rejected. They knew, in some cases, the internal disagreements within foreign governments that were affecting the shape of those governments' public positions. The diplomatic advantage this conferred was not merely marginal. It was, in contested negotiations over significant matters, potentially decisive. The CIA's internal history of the program reportedly described this sustained diplomatic intelligence access with a detail and an enthusiasm that reflected genuine institutional pride in the operation's productivity. The language of intelligence professionals assessing their own achievements can tend toward understatement in some respects and self-congratulation in others, and the Rubicon history evidently found the appropriate register for describing what was, by any standard, an extraordinary achievement of sustained intelligence collection over a period that spanned multiple decades and multiple generations of analysts and managers. The governments being read, for their part, had absolutely no reason to suspect any of it. The crypto AG machines in their cipher rooms were the same machines they had always used, maintained by the same company's service representatives, updated through the same commercial upgrade cycles that commercial customers everywhere expected. The Swiss origin of the machines remained a guarantee of trustworthiness in the minds of the officials who relied on them. The company's reputation had been built over decades of apparent commercial integrity, and there was no visible crack in the facade, no external signal that what they believed they possessed was something other than what it appeared to be. The tens of thousands of messages encrypted and transmitted in the faith that those machines were impenetrable constitute, in retrospect, one of history's great collective miscalculations. A miscalculation distributed across dozens of governments whose technical advisors, intelligence, counterintelligence services, and procurement officials all looked at crypto AG machines and saw exactly what those machines had been designed to suggest. The deception was total because it was built into the physical object, into the mechanism itself, in ways that were invisible without knowledge of the specific flaw that had been introduced. There was nothing to see because there was nothing external to observe. The vulnerability lived inside the machine, in the gap between the security the machine was supposed to provide and the security it actually provided, a gap that existed solely in the knowledge of the people who had put it there. Hans Buehler was, by any description available from his years at Crypto AG, exactly the kind of salesman that a company selling sophisticated technical equipment to foreign governments most wanted and most needed. He was energetic, multilingual, professionally confident, and gifted with the particular interpersonal intelligence that allows a person to move comfortably across cultural boundaries and establish the kind of personal rapport with foreign officials that translated, over time, into loyal commercial relationships. He had joined Crypto AG in the 1970s and built his career in the Middle East, becoming over the course of more than a decade the company's primary point of contact for the Iranian market, one of its most important and most consistently loyal accounts. Iran had been a Crypto AG customer since the era of the Shah, and the relationship had survived the 1979 revolution with remarkable resilience. The new Islamic Republic, whatever its differences with the previous government, had inherited the same practical requirements for secure diplomatic and military communication, and the Crypto AG machines that were already installed in Iranian government cipher rooms represented an institutional infrastructure that was difficult to replace quickly. Iran had continued to buy Crypto AG equipment after the revolution, and Buehler had continued to travel to Tehran, maintaining the commercial relationship with the same mixture of technical expertise and personal warmth that had characterized his work across the region. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Buehler was one of Crypto AG's most productive salesmen, handling accounts across the Middle East and earning the kind of respect from his customers that came with years of reliable service and genuine technical knowledge. He was not an intelligence officer. He had no knowledge of and no connection to the CIA or BND ownership structure that governed the company's actual management. He believed that he was selling the world's best cipher machines to customers who needed secure communications, and he took genuine professional pride in his work. The gap between that professional identity and the reality of what the machines he sold were actually doing to his customers' communications was a gap he could not see, because no one at Crypto AG who knew about it had any reason to tell him. In March of 1992, Bueller arrived in Tehran on a routine business trip. He had made the journey many times before, knew the logistics of traveling to Iran with the practiced ease of long familiarity, and had pre-existing appointments scheduled with Iranian government procurement officials about equipment upgrades and new orders. He checked into his hotel with the settled routine of someone whose professional travel had made him as comfortable in foreign capitals as in his own country. There was nothing unusual about his arrival, nothing in the circumstances of his trip that differed in any meaningful way from the dozens of similar trips he had made over the preceding years. The Iranians who arrested him did not announce their suspicions in advance. He was detained by agents of Iranian intelligence, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and taken to a detention facility whose precise location the subsequent accounts do not fully specify. The arrest came without warning and without the presentation of any specific charge that Bueller could immediately address. He found himself, with the abruptness that intelligence service operations typically involve, in a situation for which nothing in his professional experience had prepared him. The interrogations that followed over the subsequent weeks and months were focused, according to Bueller's later accounts, on a single central question. Was Crypto AG a front for Western intelligence? And did its machines incorporate deliberate vulnerabilities that allowed the CIA and other agencies to read communications encrypted with them? The Iranians were not, in other words, making a generalized accusation of commercial misconduct. They had specific suspicions, apparently based on their own analytical assessments of communication security and possibly on intelligence they had obtained through other channels, that the cipher machines they had been relying on for their most sensitive government communications might have been betraying them all along. Bueller's interrogation was prolonged and, by his own accounts, extremely difficult. He was held for 9 months in conditions that were psychologically punishing: the isolation, the uncertainty about the future, the repeated questioning by interrogators who clearly believed they were engaging with a person who was concealing significant knowledge. The problem that Bueller faced from the beginning of the process was that he genuinely did not know whether the accusations were true. He knew Crypto AG as a Swiss commercial company that built cipher machines. He knew his customers as government officials who trusted the company's products. He had no knowledge of any CIA relationship, any technical manipulation, or any ownership structure beyond what a normal commercial employee would know about a normal commercial company. When he said he did not know, he was telling the truth. But the Iranians had no particular reason to believe him, and the interrogation process was not primarily oriented toward determining the truth. It was oriented toward extracting acknowledgement of what the interrogators already believed they knew. The impasse between Bueller's genuine ignorance and his interrogators' genuine suspicion created the conditions for a prolonged and unresolvable standoff that kept him in detention for 9 months. Back in Zug, Crypto AG's response to the arrest produced its own set of revealing tensions. The company's public position was that Bueller was a salesman with no knowledge of any classified matters, that the accusations against him were baseless, and that Iran was behaving improperly in detaining a private commercial employee who had done nothing wrong. This position was, from one perspective, entirely accurate. Bueller really was an innocent commercial employee who really did know nothing. From another perspective, the company's defense of Bueller was the behavior of an organization with compelling reasons to maintain the fiction of its commercial innocence, since acknowledging any element of the Iranian accusations would have meant acknowledging the larger reality of CIA ownership and technical manipulation. The man who was suffering in the meantime was Hans Bueller, who had no idea that the dispute around his detention involved stakes that extended far beyond his personal situation. The CIA and BND were watching the situation with intense concern, calculating the probability that Iranian interrogation would produce disclosures that could unravel an operation whose exposure would cause significant damage across multiple intelligence services and diplomatic relationships simultaneously. The decision about how to respond to Bueller's detention was therefore not simply a humanitarian calculation about how to free an innocent employee, It was an intelligence management calculation about how to resolve the situation with the least possible exposure of the operation that had caused it. Eventually, after negotiations involving crypto AG's management and, based on the available accounts, the Swiss diplomatic infrastructure, a ransom of approximately $1 million was paid. The payment was made by Crypto AG and the funds were drawn from company accounts, a financial transaction that, when Buehler later began to investigate the circumstances of his detention, struck him as one of many details that did not quite fit the behavior of a company that had nothing to hide. A normal commercial company, confronted with the baseless detention of an innocent employee by a foreign government, might pursue diplomatic pressure, public advocacy, or legal channels. Paying $1 million in ransom, without public acknowledgement and without any subsequent effort to seek accountability for the wrongful detention, suggested a company that had specific reasons for wanting the matter resolved quietly and quickly. Buehler returned to Switzerland in January 1993, physically diminished and psychologically shaken by 9 months of captivity. He expected to return to his position at Crypto AG, expecting the gratitude of his employer and some explanation of what, exactly, had given Iranian intelligence the idea that the company was connected to Western intelligence services. What he received instead was termination. Crypto AG fired him, citing performance issues, an explanation that struck Buehler as so disproportionate to his years of service and his record as one of the company's top salespeople in one of its most important markets that it could only be read as a deliberate act of management designed to remove him from any proximity to the company's operations and internal information. The firing radicalized him. Buehler, a private businessman in his 50s who had spent 20 years building a career in good faith, found himself unemployed, traumatized by 9 months of unjust detention, and unable to get any coherent explanation from the company that had employed him about why any of it had happened. He began to research. He began to talk to journalists. He began, through the grinding patience of a man with the engineer's instinct for finding what doesn't fit and the survivor's motivation for understanding what has been done to him, to piece together the outlines of the arrangement that had placed him in an Iranian detention cell without ever informing him of why. The book he eventually produced, written with journalist Residential Strahl and published in German in 1994 under the title Verschlüsselt, which translates roughly as encrypted, represented the first sustained public account of Crypto AG's relationship with Western intelligence, drawn from Buehler's own experience and from the research he had done in the aftermath of his detention. It named the CIA and the BND. It described the technical manipulation of Crypto AG's machines. It laid out, in terms accessible to a general reader, the structure of the arrangement that Boris Hagelin had established and that the 1970 purchase had formalized. The book made significant waves in German-language media but did not achieve the global breakthrough that its subject matter might have warranted. The intelligence agencies with most to lose had not yet been definitively exposed, and the general public's capacity to fully credit the idea that the world's leading encryption company was a CIA front was, at that particular moment in 1994, limited by a lack of corroborating documentation. What Buehler's book did accomplish was to place the story firmly in the public domain, in a form that journalists in Europe and eventually America would begin to take seriously and investigate further. The operation that had run undetected for more than 40 years had just acquired its first credible public accuser with first-hand knowledge of the company's operations. The clock on the program's remaining life had begun to run. The publication of Hans Buehler's book in 1994 was a warning shot that the intelligence agencies managing the Crypto AG program understood in exactly those terms. Across the Atlantic, in the monitoring offices of the CIA and in the analytical centers that tracked press reporting for indications of intelligence exposure, the appearance of a book-length public account of the program, written by a former employee with 2 decades of direct commercial experience with the company, was categorized as precisely the kind of development that required immediate assessment and, potentially, a reassessment of the operation's risk profile. The book's immediate impact in Swiss and German media was significant but bounded. Swiss public broadcasting covered the story with some energy, and German-language newspapers reported on Buehler's allegations in terms that gave them the serious consideration their specificity warranted. But the broader international reaction was more muted than the revelations might have merited. There were several reasons for this, and together they illustrate the specific mechanisms through which intelligence operations of this kind can survive partial exposure. The first was the documentation problem. Bueller's account was credible and specific, grounded in his own experience and his subsequent research, but it rested ultimately on the testimony of a man whose employer had every incentive to discredit him. Crypto AG flatly denied the allegations. The CIA and BND, operating behind the wall of classified denial, were not going to confirm anything. The Swiss government, whose own relationship with the story was complicated by the question of what Swiss authorities had known and when, was not positioned to offer corroborating information. In the absence of documentary proof, the classified CIA and BND histories that would eventually become the foundation of the 2020 revelations were still locked in agency files on both sides of the Atlantic. The story circulated without achieving the kind of hard confirmation that would have forced governments and institutions to respond in ways that could not be managed. The second factor was credibility architecture. The suggestion that a small Swiss company producing cipher machines for commercial sale might be secretly owned and operated by two major Western intelligence agencies was, in the mid-1990s, the kind of claim that most mainstream journalists and editors would assess with significant skepticism, not because it was implausible in principle, but because its scale was so large and its duration so extended that the ordinary apparatus of journalistic verification, documentation, named sources, official confirmation, was simply not available in sufficient quantity to support the story as a matter of confirmed fact rather than serious allegation. The third factor was the gradual, diffuse nature of the exposure. Bueller's book had appeared in German. It was oriented toward a German-speaking audience with some pre-existing familiarity with the Swiss and German intelligence context. Moving from that starting point to the kind of global newsroom breakthrough that would have forced a definitive official reckoning required a different kind of reporting infrastructure than what existed in 1994. That additional push came from American journalism, in the form of an investigation published by the Baltimore Sun in December 1995. Scott Shane, a reporter who would later become a prominent national security correspondent at the New York Times, and his colleagues Tom Bowman and Jeff Ecker produced a series of articles that brought the Crypto AG story to American audiences with a specificity and a sourcing depth that had not previously been publicly available. The Baltimore Sun reporting named the CIA and NSA, described the technical nature of the deliberate vulnerabilities built into Crypto AG machines, identified the categories of governments affected, and drew on sources within the American intelligence and signals intelligence communities who were prepared to confirm, with more or less explicitness, elements of what Bueller had alleged. The impact of the Baltimore Sun series was considerably greater than the impact of Bueller's book in German-speaking Europe, partly because of the American venue and partly because American sources lent the story a corroboration that it had previously lacked. The series generated responses in multiple countries that had been Crypto AG customers. Some governments launched official inquiries. Others quietly reassessed the security of their current cipher infrastructure. Diplomatic responses were filed through channels. And several countries, by various accounts, made the decision to stop purchasing Crypto AG equipment after the Baltimore Sun series raised specific and documented questions about the integrity of the company's products. Inside the CIA and the program's management structure, the Baltimore Sun series was assessed with the same combination of concern and damage limitation calculation that had attended Bueller's book. The operational exposure was real. Countries were abandoning the program as customers, which meant the intelligence collection from those countries was ending. The story was now in the American mainstream media in a form that was much harder to contain through standard denial than the German-language publication had been. And the possibility that additional documentation might surface, or that additional sources might come forward, was no longer theoretical. The agencies responded with the tools available: continued denial, the maintenance of the company's commercial operations, and a careful assessment of which aspects of the program's technical architecture remained unexposed and could continue to generate intelligence even with some customers having dropped out. The program was wounded, but it was not finished. Enough governments continued to use Crypto AG equipment, some because they hadn't followed the press coverage, some because they evaluated the allegations as unproven, some because the institutional friction of switching systems was greater than the incentive to move, that the collection continued at reduced but still significant levels through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Within Crypto AG itself, the pressures generated by the exposure were felt differently at different levels of the organization. For the employees who had no knowledge of the CIA connection, the press allegations were bewildering and professionally threatening. An attack on the integrity of the company they had spent careers building, based on claims they had no means of evaluating. Some became intensely loyal defenders of the company against what they saw as baseless accusations. Others reached private conclusions consistent with what the reporting alleged, but had no avenue for acting on those conclusions that didn't involve personal risk and professional isolation. The company managed these internal tensions in the way that companies under external pressure typically do, through communication that emphasized uncertainty, reassured employees of the company's legitimacy, and discouraged the kind of internal investigation that might have produced uncomfortable findings. The operational adjustments made to the program in the aftermath of the mid-1990s exposure included some significant compromises. The categories of customers who left the program represented, in some cases, exactly the governments whose communications had been most valuable. Iran, which had retained its suspicions from the Bueller arrest, completed its exit from Crypto AG dependence. Other countries in the Middle East reassessed. The program's commercial base contracted. But internationally, and especially in Africa, Latin America, and smaller Asian markets, the Crypto AG brand retained its commercial reputation, and the machines already installed in government cipher rooms continued to function, continued to receive service from Crypto AG representatives, and continued to encrypt the communications that were being quietly collected by American analysts who knew exactly what to do with the traffic those machines produced. The story had been partially told, partially proved, and substantially denied. The world had been given a glimpse through a window into one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations of the 20th century, and had not quite managed to see it clearly enough to force the full accounting that the truth warranted. That accounting was still more than 2 decades away. In the meantime, the program continued, diminished, but determined to extract whatever value remained from an operation whose survival was itself a remarkable testament to the institutional capacity of intelligence agencies to absorb external pressure and keep running. The cracks in the armor were real. The armor, for now, remained. And behind it, the machines kept spinning their pseudo-random sequences, generating cipher text that certain governments believed was protecting their secrets, while other governments read those secrets before the ink of the original message was metaphorically dry. German reunification, completed in October 1990, represented one of the most significant geopolitical events in post-war European history, a rapid and largely peaceful resolution of the division that had defined Central Europe since 1945. For the BND, the Federal Republic's Foreign Intelligence Service, reunification generated a set of institutional changes and political pressures that reached into every aspect of the agency's operations, including its participation in the Crypto AG program. The newly unified Germany of the early 1990s occupied an awkward political position in relation to its history of intelligence operations. The BND was an institution that had been built under American tutelage during the Cold War, shaped by the specific intelligence priorities of a federal republic that understood itself as a frontline state in the superpower confrontation and structured its foreign intelligence activities accordingly. The end of the Cold War, and with it the end of the existential threat to German sovereignty from the East, created space for political reflection on what the BND had been doing in its decades of operation, reflection that the institution itself was not always eager to encourage or to welcome. The question of what the BND had known about, authorized, or participated in during the decades of the Crypto AG program was politically sensitive in the reunified Germany in ways that it had not been during the divided Germany of the Cold War. In the earlier period, the argument for intelligence operations against adversary governments, including operations that involved commercial deception of foreign states, had the clarity of a defensive posture in a zero-sum competition. In the post-1990 environment, where Germany was attempting to redefine its role in European and global politics as a civilian power committed to multilateralism and the rule of law, the moral calculus of participation in a program that had been systematically deceiving foreign governments for 2 decades was considerably less comfortable. There was also the specific political problem of what the crypto AG program had actually produced against which governments. The machines sold through crypto AG had gone to customers across the developing world, including many countries with which West Germany had maintained diplomatic, commercial, and development aid relationships that were publicly premised on partnership and mutual respect. The discovery, were it to be made publicly, that West German intelligence had been secretly reading the communications of governments that were simultaneously being courted by West German foreign policy would have created contradictions that the reunified German government would have found genuinely difficult to manage. And there was the question of allies. The crypto AG program had, over its decades of operation, generated intelligence on governments that included some that were, in formal diplomatic terms, friendly to the Western alliance. The machines had been sold commercially, without restriction to the categories of customer who were provided with the weakened versions, to a wide range of governments that spanned the full spectrum from Cold War adversaries to nominal Western allies to genuinely non-aligned states. The intelligence that flowed from this collection was not sorted by formal diplomatic alignment before it was consumed. The agencies collected what the machines produced and processed it as the analytical priorities of the moment required. If the BND's involvement in the program were to become publicly known in any detail, the questions about which governments had been targeted, and specifically whether German intelligence had been reading the communications of European governments, developing world governments receiving German aid, or governments with whom Germany maintained formal diplomatic relationships premised on different assumptions, would be considerably more damaging than the American equivalent. The United States, with its established reputation for aggressive signals intelligence collection, and its history of acknowledged programs that had generated controversy without ultimately succeeding in forcing accountability, was better positioned to absorb the political damage of exposure than Germany, whose post-war political identity was premised in part on a rejection of the kind of state behavior that the crypto AG program represented. For all of these reasons, the BND made the decision in the early 1990s to exit the crypto AG arrangement. The precise timing of the German withdrawal is not entirely clear in the public documentary record, and some accounts date the effective handoff to approximately 1993, while others suggest it extended through 1994, but the general outline is consistent. The BND sold its share of the crypto AG ownership to the CIA, which thereby became the sole beneficial owner of the company, and Germany's formal participation in the program was terminated. The financial terms of the BND's exit from the arrangement reflect the commercial reality of what was being sold. Not a company valued primarily on its commercial earnings, but an intelligence asset valued on the basis of the continuing collection it could support. The CIA paid what the accounts describe as a substantial sum for the BND's share, a sum that reflected not just the nominal book value of a cipher machine company, but the ongoing intelligence premium associated with owning the world's most widely deployed encryption vendor. For the CIA, the purchase of the BND's share was not simply the acquisition of a larger piece of an existing arrangement. It was the assumption of full operational control over a program that had previously required coordination with a partner agency whose interests and risk tolerances were not always identical with American ones. The BND had been, in most respects, a cooperative and reliable partner, but partnership involves compromise, and the CIA's assumption of sole ownership simplified the management of the program and gave American intelligence officers direct authority over every aspect of the company's technical development, commercial strategy, and customer relationships. The transition was managed with the discretion that the program's sensitivity required. Crypto AG's commercial operations continued without visible disruption. Its employees, overwhelmingly Swiss citizens who had spent their careers at the company in good faith, continued to do the work they had always done. The customer base that remained after the mid-1990s press exposure was retained through the same combination of long-term institutional relationships, competitive pricing, and the genuine quality of the machines that had always characterized the company's commercial position. What was perhaps most remarkable about the German exit, viewed in retrospect, was the evidence it provided of the specific institutional logic that had shaped the BND's participation from the beginning. The West Germans had joined the program not simply because the CIA had recruited them to it, but because participation served German intelligence interests in ways that were real, even if the moral dimensions of those interests were complicated. The intelligence collected through crypto AG machines in the markets where Germany's commercial and diplomatic presence was strongest provided the BND with a window into foreign government decision-making that it could not have obtained through any other means available to a medium-sized Western intelligence service. When the strategic environment changed, when reunification altered the political context in which German intelligence was operating, and when the Bueller case and subsequent press coverage increased the exposure risk of continued participation, the BND's assessment of the program's cost-benefit ratio shifted accordingly. The CIA's assessment of the same ratio pointed in a different direction. American intelligence had more to lose in terms of absolute collection volume from abandoning the program, and more institutional capacity to manage the exposure risks that the mid-1990s press coverage had created. The decision to continue alone, to buy out the German share rather than wind down the operation, reflected a specifically American institutional judgment about the value of the program relative to its risks, a judgment that would keep the CIA in the encryption business for another 2 decades. The era of joint ownership was over. The era of American sole ownership was beginning, and the program was about to enter its most complicated phase, navigating the dual challenge of continuing to collect intelligence from a customer base that had been partially alerted to its exposure, while simultaneously trying to survive in a world where the commercial and technological landscape of encryption was changing faster than any single company's product line could easily track. The world that Crypto AG was navigating in the years after the BND's departure was profoundly different from the one in which Boris Hagelin had built his company. The mid-1990s were precisely the moment when the digital transformation of global communication was accelerating from theoretical possibility to practical reality at a pace that no institution in the world, commercial or governmental, was entirely prepared for. The Internet, which had existed in various forms within academic and military networks since the late 1960s, was expanding with extraordinary speed into the commercial and civilian domain, and with it was coming a set of questions about encryption that the hardware cipher machine industry had never been required to confront in quite the same way. The encryption that crypto AG machines had provided since the 1950s was a physical, mechanical form of security embedded in a specific device, operated by a trained clerk, applied to specific categories of official communication traffic. This was the encryption model that governments had used for generations, and it suited the organizational structure of government communication beautifully. You bought machines, you trained operators, you established protocols, and you used the machines for the communications they were designed to protect. The machine was an institution as much as it was a device, and the institutions that maintained the machine's operational culture provided a genuine barrier to the casual compromise that could occur when security was understood as something individual users applied to individual communications. The digital world that was emerging in the mid-1990s operated on entirely different principles. Communications were being transmitted through computer networks using software-based encryption protocols that could in principle run on any hardware, could be implemented by any sufficiently skilled software developer, and could be distributed at essentially zero marginal cost across networks that reached everywhere. The transition from hardware to software encryption was not merely a change in the medium through which security was provided. It was a change in the entire commercial and operational structure of the encryption market, and it posed a direct threat to the business model that Crypto AG had spent 4 decades building. For the CIA, which owned Crypto AG and managed its technical development as an intelligence operation, the transition to software-based encryption created challenges that the hardware manipulation model could not readily address. The specific technique of building deliberate vulnerabilities into physical cipher machines, adjusting the pin configurations, modifying the electronic circuit designs, calibrating the algorithm implementations to produce exploitable weaknesses, was a technique designed for a world in which encryption was implemented in physical objects that could be controlled during manufacture. Software encryption was a different beast. Distributed, auditable at the code level by anyone with the right expertise, and potentially implementable by any government with sufficiently skilled computer scientists without purchasing anything from any commercial vendor. The response of the CIA's management of Crypto AG during this period was to maintain the company's position in its existing hardware markets while exploring, cautiously, and without full resolution, how the product line might be adapted to the new environment. The governments that continued to use Crypto AG equipment in the late 1990s and 2000s were generally not the governments at the leading edge of digital modernization. They were, in many cases, smaller states, developing world governments, and institutions with established operational procedures built around the hardware cipher machine infrastructure that they had used for years. The institutional inertia that had made Crypto AG such a robust commercial operation in the 1970s and 1980s continued to work in its favor in some markets, even as the most sophisticated customers were migrating to different approaches. The company's commercial operations in this period presented a picture of steady, if slowing, activity. Sales continued. Service contracts were maintained. New machine designs were introduced to replace aging hardware that had reached the end of its operational life. The Swiss employees who staffed the company's Zug headquarters and its service operations around the world continued their professional routines with the combination of technical precision and commercial acumen that had characterized the company since Hagelin's day. There is something genuinely poignant, in retrospect, about the ordinariness of daily life at a company whose entire commercial foundation was an intelligence deception, inhabited by hundreds of people who were working honestly in a context they could not fully understand. The CIA's management of the program through this period involved ongoing assessments of the intelligence return relative to the operational exposure risk. The risk had been elevated since the mid-1990s and remained elevated, never fully resolving back to the comfortable obscurity of the years before the Buehler case. Each press report that referenced Crypto AG, each official investigation in Switzerland or elsewhere that circled the question of the company's ownership, each journalist who asked questions that suggested awareness of the larger story, required evaluation and calculation. The program managers knew that the exposure they had survived in the mid-1990s had been partial and incomplete, that the full documentation, the classified histories, the specific technical details of how the manipulation had worked, were still in agency files where they had always been. A second round of press attention, particularly if it were accompanied by documentary evidence rather than testimonial allegation, would be considerably harder to manage. The internal tension this created within the program's management, between the ongoing operational value of continued collection from the remaining customer base and the escalating institutional risk of maintaining an operation that had already been publicly alleged by credible sources, was a tension that the CIA lived with, apparently, for another decade and a half after the BND's departure, without resolving it in either direction with any finality. In 2018, the operational and commercial trajectory of Crypto AG reached a conclusion of sorts, even if not the definitive one that the full exposure would eventually bring. The company was, in that year, divided into two separate entities through a sale process whose commercial terms and official rationale were presented publicly as a straightforward business restructuring. One entity, retaining the Crypto AG brand and oriented toward international commercial markets, was sold to a Swedish investment group under the leadership of an investor named Andreas Linde. This entity was subsequently renamed Crypto International, maintaining the commercial franchise and the brand recognition that the Crypto AG name carried in the markets it served. The other entity, named Psi1 Security, retained the domestic Swiss business, specifically the contracts supplying cipher equipment to the Swiss government itself, and was structured as a Swiss domestic company with Swiss ownership. The separation of the international commercial business from the domestic Swiss business was, from the perspective of the CIA's management of the program, a restructuring that reflected the changed landscape of both the commercial cipher machine market and the program's operational possibilities. The international business that continued under the Crypto International name was positioned to maintain whatever collection could be sustained from the remaining customer base. The domestic Swiss business was carved out in a way that separated the most politically sensitive element, the possibility that Swiss government communications had themselves been compromised, from the broader commercial operation. Whether the CIA maintained any form of operational relationship with either entity after the 2018 restructuring is not definitively established in the public record as of the time of the 2020 revelations. What is established is that by 2018, the program's original architecture, secretive ownership of a commercial cipher machine company, had been dissolved, and the intelligence collection model that had operated continuously since the early 1950s had reached a structural endpoint. The 50-plus years of Operation Rubicon, from the Gentleman's Agreement of 1951 through the formal purchase of 1970 and the decades of sustained collection that followed, were over. What remained was the documentary record, the internal histories that the CIA and BND had produced to memorialize their own achievement, locked in classified archives on two continents, and the question of when and by whom and under what circumstances that record would eventually reach the light. The document that changed everything arrived through the channels that classified documents typically travel when they make their way from institutional custody to journalistic hands, through a process whose specific mechanics are rarely disclosed fully, whose chain of provenance is deliberately obscured to protect sources, and whose arrival at a reporter's desk represents the product of months or years of institutional access, trust building, and careful positioning by people whose motivations may be complex and whose identities remain protected. By the time Greg Miller of The Washington Post received what would become the centerpiece of the February 2020 investigation, he and his colleagues had been working on the Crypto AG story for an extended period. ZDF, the German public broadcaster, had been conducting its own parallel investigation, and the Swiss public broadcaster SRF had been engaged in the same pursuit. The three organizations had collaborated on the investigation's development, sharing reporting and coordinating toward a simultaneous publication that would give the story the greatest possible initial impact. A standard approach for major investigative partnerships that understand that the first moments of a story's life shape how it is received by audiences and by the officials it concerns. The document they had obtained was a classified CIA history, a comprehensive internal account of the Crypto AG program produced by the agency for its own institutional records, running to well over 100 pages, and written in the specific register of intelligence agency self-documentation. Factual in its presentation, institutional in its perspective, and frank in a way that the same agency's public communications never were. The history described the program from its origins. It named the participating agencies, described the ownership structure, characterized the technical manipulation built into the cipher machines, and assessed the intelligence value the program had produced across its decades of operation. It described specific operations enabled by Crypto AG intelligence. It acknowledged the risks that had materialized in the Buehler case and in the mid-1990s press coverage. And it used, in describing the program's overall achievement, the phrase that would become the headline of every story written about the revelations: the intelligence coup of the century. In addition to the CIA history, the journalists had obtained a separate internal account produced by the BND, a German-language document that covered much of the same ground from the perspective of the German agency's participation, with particular attention to the operational relationship between the BND and the CIA over the decades of joint ownership, and to the circumstances and rationale of the German exit in the early 1990s. Together, the two documents provided what journalistic verification standards require for a story of this magnitude: multiple independent official sources in documentary form, describing the same program from the perspectives of the two agencies that ran it. The publication coordination was careful and precise. The Washington Post, ZDF, and SRF agreed to publish simultaneously on the morning of February 11, 2020, ensuring that the story would break globally rather than sequentially, that no single government or agency would have advance notice from one outlet that would allow it to begin damage limitation before the full story was in circulation. The coordination extended to the translations required for the German language component of the story, to the visual presentation of the documentary evidence, and to the supporting research that placed the documents in their historical and operational context. February 11, 2020 was a Tuesday. The stories appeared in the early hours of the morning Washington time in time for the opening of the American news cycle, and they landed with the force of a revelation that the intelligence world, and the diplomatic world, and the public world had not seen in a very long time. The Washington Post's lead story, under Greg Miller's byline, opened with the CIA's own description of the program and immediately established the scope of what had been done. More than 120 countries targeted, more than 50 years of operation, the deliberate manipulation of commercial cipher machines to allow sustained intelligence collection on a global scale, a program operated from inside a neutral democratic country with the tacit complicity, or at minimum the willful, ignorance of some portion of the Swiss establishment. The initial reaction from governments that had been Crypto AG customers was a mixture of shock, denial, and the carefully managed fury of officials who understood that the full implications of what they were now reading would take time to absorb. In Iran, where the suspicion of Crypto AG had been present since the Buehler interrogations of the early 1990s, The confirmation that those suspicions had been entirely correct was publicly framed as an exposure of Western treachery, language that was, in the strict factual sense, not far from accurate. In India, which had been among the larger crypto AG customer countries, government officials expressed what the diplomatic cable language described as deep concern and announced preliminary reviews of the security of past government communications. Similar announcements followed in various other affected countries across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. In Switzerland, the response was most immediately consequential in institutional terms. The Swiss government, confronted with the revelation that a company incorporated in its territory and bearing the Swiss flag of commercial reputation had been operated for decades by foreign intelligence agencies, launched 3 separate formal investigations. One through the Swiss Parliament, one through the Swiss Defense Ministry, and one through the Federal Intelligence Service. The political dimension of the Swiss response was complicated by the question of what Swiss authorities had known, when they had known it, and what obligations they might have had to the governments that had relied on Swiss neutrality as an implicit guarantee of the integrity of Swiss-made products. This question did not have a comfortable answer. Swiss banking secrecy and Swiss corporate law had provided exactly the legal infrastructure that the CIA and BND required to maintain their concealed ownership. Swiss neutrality had provided exactly the commercial reputation that made crypto AG machines attractive to governments that would never have purchased American-made encryption equipment. Whether any element of the Swiss government had been formally briefed about the program's nature, or whether Swiss authorities had simply maintained the institutional incuriosity that their legal framework enabled, was a question that the Swiss investigations would circle without fully resolving. The CIA's response to the February 11th publication was silence, the formal, institutional silence of an agency that neither confirms nor denies the existence of classified programs, applied here to a situation where the existence and details of the program had been documented in the agency's own words. A CIA spokesperson declined to comment, a non-answer that was, in the specific context of an agency whose own internal history was being quoted in the press, a form of confirmation more definitive than any official statement would have been. The BND's response in Germany was somewhat more complicated, because the West German parliament, the Bundestag, had never formally been informed of the program, and the question of whether the BND's participation in a commercial deception operation of this scale had violated German law or constitutional norms was one that German politicians were not willing to simply absorb without comment. German officials acknowledged, in carefully worded statements, that the BND had been involved in an operation involving crypto AG, and indicated that the full extent of the German parliament's information about the program would be reviewed. The reviews, predictably, produced more questions than they resolved. For the former crypto AG employees who had worked for the company in good faith, the publication of the Washington Post investigation was a moment of professional and personal devastation of a specific kind, the kind that comes when you discover that the institution to which you devoted years of your working life was not what you believed it to be. Some of them gave interviews in the aftermath of the publication, describing their disbelief, their grief, their sense of having been used as unwitting instruments of a deception they had never consented to and never suspected. Their voices added a human dimension to the bureaucratic record that the CIA and BND documents provided, a reminder that the costs of large-scale institutional deception fall not only on the foreign governments who were the program's primary targets, but on the ordinary people who were caught in its orbit. Hans Buehler, who had spent the years since 1994 living with the knowledge that his professional life had been built on a lie, and whose arrest and detention in Iran in 1992 had been the direct consequence of an operation he had never known about, was still alive in 2020. He had been vindicated in the most definitive possible terms. The book he had written after his firing, the book that Crypto AG had denied, that intelligence officials had declined to confirm, that journalists had struggled to document sufficiently to bring to the mainstream, had been correct in every material particular. His 9 months in Iranian detention, his firing, his professional isolation, and his years of investigation had all been the cost he paid for working in good faith for a company that could not afford to have him know the truth. The story of Operation Rubicon had finally been told in full. The question now was what, if anything, the telling would change. In the weeks and months that followed the February 2020 publication, the governments most directly affected by the crypto AG revelations were engaged in a set of activities that bore, in their formal structure, a considerable resemblance to the activities of governments everywhere when they receive information whose implications they would prefer not to fully reckon with. They launched investigations, they issued statements, they scheduled hearings, and they allowed the institutional machinery of formal inquiry to process the story at a pace that ensured it would remain technically unresolved long enough for the initial intensity of public attention to diminish. The Swiss parliamentary investigation was the most elaborate of these institutional responses, involving a special committee with access to information about what Swiss authorities had known about crypto AG's ownership at various points during the program's operation. The findings of that investigation, released in a report in 2023, confirmed much of what the CIA and BND documents had already established about the program's nature and scope, while also addressing the specific question of Swiss official awareness in terms that were somewhat more qualified. The report found evidence suggesting that some Swiss government officials had known, at various points, that crypto AG had relationships with foreign intelligence services, but concluded that the full extent of CIA ownership and machine manipulation had not been formally disclosed to Swiss authorities in a way that would have engaged their legal obligations. Whether this finding fully absolved Swiss institutions of the broader responsibility that flows from the exploitation of Swiss neutrality as commercial cover for a surveillance program, a moral question distinct from the legal one, was left, as it typically is, for others to reach their own conclusions about. The affected countries that had been crypto AG customers for decades were left with a question that no investigation could fully answer. What had been taken from them? The communications of their governments, their military establishments, their foreign ministries, their intelligence services, had been read by American and West German analysts for periods ranging from years to decades. What had been done with that intelligence? How had it shaped diplomatic negotiations, military planning, intelligence operations, and policy decisions in ways that disadvantaged the governments whose communications were compromised? The counterfactual history of what might have been different if those communications had actually been secure is, by its nature, impossible to reconstruct with any precision. The secret history, the record of specific decisions made, operations authorized, and policies shaped by intelligence derived from crypto AG collection, remains largely classified, even after the 2020 revelations. What can be said, based on the CIA's own description of the program's value, is that the intelligence was used. The coup of the century, as the CIA described it in its internal history, was a coup precisely because it produced actionable intelligence over an extended period, and agencies do not apply that description to collection programs whose output sits unread in filing cabinets. The Iran hostage crisis, the Falklands War, the Libya bombing, and dozens of lesser-documented operational decisions were shaped to some degree by intelligence derived from the program. In each case, the specific causal contribution of the crypto AG intelligence to the eventual outcome is difficult to isolate from the many other sources and considerations that went into the relevant decisions, but the access was real, the intelligence was consumed, and the consumption had effects. For the developing world governments that formed the bulk of crypto AG's customer base, the revelation carried a specific resonance that went beyond the immediate question of communication security. These were governments that had, in many cases, explicitly sought to use Swiss-made encryption precisely to avoid the surveillance of the major powers, to communicate with each other and internally in a way that was not mediated through American or Soviet intelligence collection. The discovery that the instrument they had used to achieve this independence was itself an American intelligence tool represented a particularly complete form of betrayal, closing off the avenue of self-protection they had specifically chosen. The geopolitical asymmetry between powerful and less powerful states, which manifests in many forms across many domains, had here taken the specific form of a commercial product marketed as the means of sovereign communication security that was, in reality, its opposite. The digital age context of the revelation added dimensions that the Cold War frame of the story's operation could not fully contain. When Operation Rubicon began, the world's commercial encryption market, the market in which crypto AG operated, was a small, specialized field serving governments and large institutions with specific security requirements. Today, encryption is embedded in the everyday digital infrastructure of billions of people. In the messaging applications that carry private conversations, in the financial systems that process commercial transactions, in the healthcare systems that store medical records, and in the communications of civil society organizations, journalists, and individuals that depend on cryptographic security to protect themselves from surveillance by governments with whom they are in various stages of conflict. The question that the crypto AG story raises for this contemporary context is not merely historical. It is immediate and operational. How confident can any user of commercially sold encryption be that the product they are using has not been secretly compromised in ways they cannot detect? This question is not paranoid speculation. It is the question that the history of Operation Rubicon demands that technically informed people ask, because the answer to the historical version of the question, were commercially sold encryption products secretly compromised for intelligence collection purposes, is now definitively yes. The answer was yes for 50 years. The mechanisms that made it possible, commercial ownership, technical manipulation at the design level, institutional secrecy enforced through classification and through the self-interest of the participating parties, are not mechanisms that ceased to exist when the CIA's arrangement with Crypto AG was wound down. The debates about encryption backdoors that have recurred periodically in the American public policy conversation, debates in which law enforcement and intelligence agencies have argued for the incorporation of government access mechanisms into commercial encryption products, and in which the technology industry and civil liberties organizations have argued against on the grounds that any such backdoor weakens security for all users, take on a different character when read against the crypto AG history. The agencies arguing for backdoors in 2015 or 2020 are aware, because they were part of it, that the United States government ran a commercial encryption backdoor program at precisely this scale for more than half a century. Their arguments about why the same principle should not apply to contemporary software encryption are arguments whose shape is determined in part by their knowledge of this history. For Boris Hagelin, who spent his final years in comfortable retirement in Zug, the question of what he had done with his life's work is one that history has answered in his absence. He was, by the evidence, a genuinely brilliant engineer who made a genuinely extraordinary contribution to the field of cipher machine design. He was also a man who made a specific moral choice, or a series of specific moral choices, that placed his invention in the service of a program that deceived more than 100 governments for more than 5 decades. Whether he understood the full scope of what he had authorized, whether the ideological convictions that shaped his initial agreement with American intelligence survived intact through the decades during which its implications accumulated, whether he spent his last years in Switzerland with a clear conscience or with the complicated internal reckoning of someone who had done something that could not quite be undone. These are questions that no archive yet available answers with the completeness they deserve. What the archive does establish is the scope of the operation he enabled. One company, operating under the flag of Swiss neutrality, selling what appeared to be the world's best cipher machines to governments that trusted them with everything, while the people who actually owned and controlled that company collected the product of those machines' failures and used it to understand, and in many cases to influence, the most sensitive deliberations of sovereign governments on every inhabited continent. The operation persisted because it worked, because the secrecy of all the relevant parties was sustained, because the commercial reputation of the product was real in ways that made it attractive even to buyers who might otherwise have been suspicious, and because the institutional infrastructure of democratic intelligence services, classification, compartmentalization, the culture of need to know, protected it from the kind of accountability that more visible government programs attracted. The story of Operation Rubicon ends, as so many espionage stories do, not with a trial or a definitive accounting but with documents, with the institutional self-portrait of the agencies that ran the program, written for their own purposes, reflecting their own values, and released to the public through the persistent work of journalists who understood that the public had a right to know what had been done in its name and in the name of its allies. Those documents exist now in the public domain. The cipher machines that Boris Hagelin built in his Stockholm workshop, that American soldiers carried through the hedgerows of Normandy, that foreign ministers trusted with the communications of sovereign nations on every continent, are museum pieces and historical artifacts. The companies that descended from Crypto AG operate in markets transformed beyond recognition from anything Hagelin could have imagined. The Cold War that provided the ideological architecture for the program's justification ended more than 30 years ago. What has not ended is the question that the program's history poses to every generation that inherits the tools and the temptations of modern signals intelligence. What are the limits of surveillance that a democracy can pursue before the pursuit itself becomes incompatible with the values the democracy claims to defend? The governments that were deceived by crypto AG machines were not all democracies. Some were authoritarian states with records of serious human rights violations, and the American government's ability to read their communications may well have served purposes that were genuinely in the interest of human security in particular instances. Others were civilian governments of developing nations whose primary sin was non-alignment, whose communications were being read not because they posed a threat but because reading was possible and reading was valuable and the intelligence agencies that could read chose to. The machinery of surveillance, once built and perfected, does not distinguish easily between targets that deserve surveillance and targets that merely invite it by the accident of their communication choices. That was true of the crypto AG machines in the 1970s and 1980s. It is true of the digital infrastructure that replaced them. And it will be true of whatever comes next, unless the reckoning that the history of Operation Rubicon demands produces something more than investigations that find comfort in procedural conclusions, more than official statements that acknowledge facts without accepting responsibility, and more than a public conversation that remembers carefully for a few news cycles and then moves on to the next revelation, the next cipher, the next secret that will eventually refuse to stay buried.